On the morning of the 23rd of July 2006, a 74-year-old artist named Maurice Agus was standing in Riverside Park in a town called Chester-le-Street in England. And he was not happy. He paced back and forth on the grass, his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the massive, brightly colored structure that was supposed to be his masterpiece. This was supposed to be one of the biggest, most important days of his entire 40-year career. But right now, things were going wrong. The exhibit was called Dreamspace, and it was enormous. Imagine something about half the size of a soccer field made of translucent, colored plastic, all inflated to create a sprawling network of interconnected tunnels and domes. The whole idea was for people to walk through it, to get lost in this world of color and light and sound. Maurice had designed it so that visitors could wander from a red room to a blue room to a yellow room, and the changing colors, combined with soft ambient music piped throughout the structure, would create an immersive, almost meditative experience. It was art you could walk into and live inside, if only for a little while. And this was by far the biggest and most ambitious physical exhibit Maurice had ever attempted. It had taken months of planning, a huge amount of money, and a dedicated team to get it built and transported here. Naturally, there had been some issues along the way, some construction hiccups and logistical headaches, but Maurice was sure it would all be worth it. He knew that placing it right in the middle of a popular public park on a summer weekend meant it was going to be seen by a lot of people. This was his chance to bring his art to the masses, to give them an experience they would never forget. But before they could officially open the doors to the public, there was still one more hiccup to deal with, and it was a big one. When Maurice had arrived at the park early that morning, ready for the grand opening, he'd done a final inspection. And his heart sank. He realized that part of his exhibit hadn't been set up correctly. Some sections weren't fully inflated, and more importantly, the anchoring system, the network of ropes and pegs that held the massive inflatable to the ground, wasn't complete. He and his staff immediately got to work, rushing around to fix everything. They had to reinflate certain chambers, adjust the tension on some of the ropes, and add some finishing touches to the exterior to make it look perfect. Maurice was a perfectionist, and he couldn't stand the thought of people seeing his masterpiece in a state that was anything less than flawless. But as he worked, he could feel the pressure mounting. He knew they really, really needed to hurry. Making all these last-minute changes was eating up precious time. They were supposed to open at 10 a.m., and it was already well past that. And Maurice could see with his own eyes the consequences of the delay. A queue was forming at the entrance. People who had already bought tickets online, families with their kids, couples on a day out, they were all lining up, looking at the closed entrance with confusion and a growing sense of annoyance. Maurice could just imagine what they were thinking. What was the holdup? Why weren't they being let inside? And a knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He was terrified that if he didn't get this thing open soon, people would just give up. They'd ask for refunds, they'd walk away, and they would never get to see how amazing his masterpiece truly was. After all his work, all his passion, the thought of it being a failure before it even opened was just devastating. So, at a certain point, Maurice just had to make a call. He stepped back and took a long look at what he and his staff had managed to fix so far. Things were looking better. They had addressed the most obvious cosmetic issues. The structure looked full and inviting. And even though, as a perfectionist, he would have loved to spend another hour or two tweaking things and making absolutely sure every single safety protocol was double and triple checked, he decided that getting Dreamspace open right now was far more important. It was good enough. So he turned to his staff, who were still working on securing some of the anchors at the back of the structure, and told them to stop what they were doing. He instructed them to go to the entrance and start letting the visitors in. The masterpiece was finally open for business. A few hours later, around 3:15 inches the afternoon, a 68-year-old woman named Elizabeth Collings walked into that same park. She was with her 14-year-old grandson, and they were just out for a casual stroll. They lived nearby, and it was just the perfect day for it. It was sunny and warm, but a light breeze was blowing, keeping things from getting too hot. Elizabeth was enjoying the simple pleasure of the moment, the wind in her hair, her grandson happily walking beside her. She felt completely at peace. But then, her grandson stopped dead in his tracks. He pointed and said, "Hey, look at that." Elizabeth turned to see what had caught his eye. And there, on the other side of the park, she saw it. This sprawling, vibrant, colorful structure with a huge line of people still waiting to get in, and the soothing, dreamy music drifting out from its open doors. Elizabeth had never seen anything like it. It looked magical, almost like something from another world had landed in the middle of their local park. She thought whatever it was, it looked incredibly intriguing. Her grandson was already excited, practically pulling on her arm to go check it out, and Elizabeth felt a little thrill of excitement herself. "All right," she said with a smile. "Let's go." A few minutes later, Elizabeth and her grandson had bought their tickets and stepped inside the exhibit. And instantly, Elizabeth knew they had made a great decision. The light inside was dim and filtered through the colored plastic walls, making it seem like they were walking through a rainbow. The dreamy, tranquil music surrounded them, and even though it was fairly crowded and a bit warm inside, it still felt remarkably peaceful. Elizabeth could feel the tension in her shoulders just melt away. Her entire body seemed to relax. For the next 10 minutes or so, she and her grandson just wandered slowly from one chamber to the next, taking in the atmosphere, the lights, and the music. They moved from a deep red room into a bright yellow one, and then into a room that was a beautiful, calming shade of blue. There was some light coming in from an adjacent room, which was a sort of brownish orange color, and when the light from that room mixed with the blue of the room they were in, it had this strange, beautiful effect of making the whole space feel like it was a deep, ethereal green. It was, just as the artist intended, a very cool, serene experience. Both Elizabeth and her grandson were completely transfixed, just standing there quietly taking it all in, and it was in that moment, as they stood together in that peaceful blue-green world, that they heard it. A deafening snapping sound, loud and sharp like a giant whip cracking right next to their ears. The moment the sound hit, Elizabeth suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented. As she stared at the colors around her, the whole room seemed to tilt sideways. She stumbled a few steps, trying to regain her balance, feeling like the floor was moving beneath her feet. At first, she wondered if maybe the heat and the strange lights were just getting to her, making her feel faint. But then she was overcome by an almost floating sensation, a feeling of impossible lightness, as if the room itself was pulling away from the ground. And then she had the terrifying realization that her feet were no longer touching the floor. Outside, Maurice Agis, the creator of Dreamspace, was mingling with the guests who were still in line. And from his perspective, the day had turned into a huge success. After the stressful morning, everything was going great. He had managed to get the last-minute fixes done just in time, and now hundreds of people had come to see his work. There were still at least 40 or 50 people in the queue, with more joining all the time. And best of all, every single person who came out of the exhibit was beaming. They were telling their friends what an incredible, amazing experience it was. The day had been saved. Maurice was filled with a sense of pride and relief. It was all going perfectly. Until he heard that snapping sound. When that loud crack echoed across the park, everyone heard it. Maurice was looking away from Dreamspace at that moment, talking to a visitor. But then he heard screams coming from behind him. He whipped around, and his brain couldn't immediately process what he was seeing. All he saw were these dark shapes just falling out of the clear blue sky, one after another, smashing into the ground with sickening thuds. For a split second, Maurice and everyone else around him were just frozen, trying to understand what these falling objects were. And then, with a wave of absolute horror, Maurice realized what he was looking at. Those shapes were people. So, let's go back to that morning, to that frantic rush to get the exhibit open. Maurice knew this was probably going to be his last big art exhibit. At 74, this was his grand finale, the exclamation point on a long and storied career. He was so worried, so completely terrified, that if he didn't get the doors open fast enough, the waiting crowd would leave, the day would be a failure, and his masterpiece would be remembered as a flop. And so, in his panic, he made a catastrophic decision. He essentially stopped his staff from finishing all the necessary work, overriding their process in favor of just getting people in the door. And the way he rationalized it to himself, and probably to his staff, was that he was just being a perfectionist. He told himself that he would have times liked, times to have done all the fixes, but that he had done times enough. He told himself it was good enough, and that was all that mattered. But the problem was, it wasn't good enough. Some of the things he overlooked, the things his staff were in the middle of doing when he told them to stop, were not just cosmetic touches. They were vital safety precautions. The most critical of these missed safety steps involved tying down a series of extra ropes to anchor the massive exhibit securely to the ground. The staff, following standard procedure, had already tied down the front of the structure, the part that was most visible to the public and the entrance. But because Maurice rushed them to get the place open, they hadn't finished anchoring the back of the exhibit. They had the ropes, they had the heavy-duty pegs, but they were told to leave them and go man the entrance instead. This would turn out to be a fatal oversight. You see, Dreamspace was not a regular, permanent building. It wasn't made of brick and concrete with a real foundation. It was, in essence, a gigantic, intricately designed, bouncy castle. It was an inflatable structure made of thin sheets of PVC plastic, the same kind of material shower curtains are made of. And even though it was a beautiful, calm day with just a light breeze blowing through the park, that was all it took. A sudden gust of wind, nothing out of the ordinary for the area, swept across the park and hit the unanchored back wall of the Dreamspace structure. Because the back wasn't tied down, the wind got underneath it and acted like a giant sail. The entire half-a-soccer field-sized structure was lifted violently into the air. The few anchors at the front, which were never designed to hold the full force of the structure on their own, snapped instantly. That was the deafening cracking sound that everyone heard. And so, in a heartbeat, this place of serenity turned into a giant, uncontrollable hot air balloon. Everyone inside, dozens of people, including Elizabeth and her grandson, were suddenly and violently thrown around as they were lifted 30 feet into the air. They were all trapped inside this twisting, contorting plastic bubble with no way to get out and no way to control it. As the wind picked up and pushed the structure higher and higher, the violent movements began to tear the plastic seams apart. The structure, as it writhed in the air, began to literally eject the people who were trapped inside of it. They were spit out of the torn holes and fell from a height of 30, 40, even 50 feet, crashing down onto the hard ground below. And that is why, when Maurice turned around, he saw all those people falling from the sky. The scene on the ground was one of absolute chaos and horror. People were screaming. The once peaceful park lawn was now littered with the injured and the dying. First responders rushed to the scene, but it was a nightmare. In the end, 27 people were seriously injured. Many suffered broken bones, head injuries, and severe trauma. And 2 people were killed. One was a 38-year-old radiographer named Claire Firmage. The other was 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings. Her grandson, who had been standing right beside her, survived the fall but was severely injured and had to witness his grandmother's final moments. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. It was led by the UK's Health and Safety Executive, or HSE. When their investigators arrived, the deflated remains of Dreamspace lay like a dead creature on the grass. The first thing they did was walk the perimeter of where the structure had been, and it didn't take them long to find the flaw. They immediately noticed the series of heavy-duty anchor points at the back of the site that had no ropes attached to them. They saw the giant metal pegs, designed to be hammered deep into the earth, lying unused on the grass. It was the smoking gun. This wasn't an act of God, it was a failure of procedure. Next, they interviewed the members of Maurice Augus's staff. And one by one, the distraught crew members told the same story. They confirmed that they had been in the process of securing all the tethers that morning. They told the investigators that they were fully aware that all the anchor points needed to be used, especially on a structure of that size. But they all said they were told to stop by Maurice himself. They recounted how he was stressed, how he was panicked about the growing queue and the delay in opening. They admitted they were instructed to leave the back anchors unsecured and to prioritize getting the doors open for the paying public. Some of the staff members even said they had felt uneasy about it at the time, but he was the artist, he was the boss, and they did what they were told. Investigators also pulled the meteorological reports for that day, and what they found made the situation even more tragic. While it had seemed like a beautiful, calm day to the average person in the park, The official weather forecast had included a warning. It specifically mentioned the possibility of sudden strong gusts of wind for that afternoon. It was a predictable weather event, not a freak tornado that came out of nowhere. Anyone responsible for securing a structure the size of a small building should have been aware of that forecast and taken extra precautions. Instead, the person in charge had taken fewer. So, the investigators were able to reconstruct exactly what happened. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was a chain of decisions that led directly to disaster. Maurice Agius, driven by his artistic ego and the financial pressure of his big day, made the conscious choice to cut corners on safety. He saw the waiting crowd and feared failure more than he feared the potential consequences of his haste. He willfully ignored the concerns of his own staff and, likely, the weather warnings for the day. That predictable gust of wind came, and it hit the structure at its weakest point, the unanchored rear wall. The force was immense, far too much for the few tethers at the front to handle. They snapped, and Dreamspace was launched. The chaos that followed, the fall, the injuries, the deaths of Claire Firmage and Elizabeth Collings, all of it was the direct result of that one decision made hours earlier, the decision that it was good enough. Maurice Agius was arrested and eventually charged with gross negligence manslaughter for the two deaths. The case went to trial, and it was complex. The prosecution laid out all the evidence found by the HSC. They argued that Agius, as the creator and operator of the exhibit, had a clear duty of care to his visitors, and that he had failed in that duty in the most catastrophic way possible. They portrayed him as a man who put his pride and his profits ahead of people's lives. But his defense team argued that this was simply a tragic accident. They painted Maurice as a passionate artist, not a safety engineer. They claimed he had relied on his team to handle the technical aspects and that he couldn't have possibly foreseen the terrible consequences of a light breeze. The first trial ended with a hung jury. They couldn't reach a unanimous decision. So, a second trial was held. And this time, the jury came back with a verdict. They found Maurice Agius not guilty of manslaughter. There was an audible gasp in the courtroom from the families of the victims. However, the jury did find him guilty of a lesser charge, a serious health and safety violation. For a breach that led to 2 deaths and dozens of injuries, his punishment was a fine of £10,000. This was later reduced to just £2,500 on appeal after his lawyers argued that he was an elderly man with no savings. For the families of Elizabeth Collings and Claire Firmage, the verdict was an insult. It felt like there had been no real justice for their loved ones. But despite the light legal punishment, what happened that day completely destroyed Maurice Agius. He may have avoided a prison sentence, but he was a broken man. The public backlash was immense, and his reputation as an artist was left in ruins. But more than that, he was haunted by the knowledge that his creation, his beautiful dream space that was meant to bring people peace and joy, had instead brought them terror and death. He was so devastated by the destruction his masterpiece had caused that he never made anything like it again. He retreated from the art world entirely. This was the last piece of art he ever did. And in fact, he died just 3 years later in 2009. In the end, 2 families were left with an empty space that could never be filled. A day that began with the simple, happy decision to take a walk in the park ended in an unimaginable and completely avoidable tragedy. It all came down to a few unused ropes and pegs lying on the grass and a man who, in a moment of pressure, decided that the show must go on, no matter the cost. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the evening of Friday, the 12th of January, 2007, a college freshman by the name of Wade Steffi, who was 19 years old at the time, ventured inside the Ford Dining Hall, which is located on the campus of Purdue University. Not only is Purdue University in Indiana a respected and well-known institution of higher learning, but it is also well known for the exceptional academic programs that it offers, in addition to the substantial athletic opportunities that it provides. When it came to a situation like that, Wade was the perfect option to meet the requirements. A full academic scholarship to attend Purdue University was awarded to him because he was such a clever young man. He was so brilliant that he was able to attend Purdue University. At the time, he was working toward earning a degree in aviation technology, a field that held the potential to provide him with a future that was not only fascinating but also dense with prospects. He had his entire life ahead of him, a life that he had worked incredibly hard to get up to this point. He had a lot of work to do. Approximately 7:20 minutes before 7 o'clock in the evening, he entered the dining hall. In the spring semester, which had only begun a few days earlier, this was the very first Friday night of the semester. Put yourself in that space and try to imagine the buzzing energy that was there. The sound of buzzing could be heard. Students were distributed around the tables, and they were all engaged in conversation, laughter, and the process of making plans for the forthcoming weekend. There were a huge number of students. There was a distinct sense of excitement in the air, the kind of energy that can only be found at the beginning of something new for the first time. After Wade had finished acquiring a tray of food, he went to find a table where he could eat with a couple of his closest friends. He took a seat and immediately began participating in the discourse that was taking place. They talked about the new classes that they were going to be attending, the parties that were going to take place that evening, and the activities that they were going to take part in now that they were going to be coming back to school. There was nothing out of the usual about it, and that was the typical way of life in college. Over the course of nearly 1 hour, Wade sat there, exhibiting all of the qualities that are typical of a college student. He had a sense of freedom and possibilities throughout the time that he was surrounded by his friends. It was almost 8:20 o'clock in the evening when Wade looked at the time and realized that he needed to get going in order to meet his obligations. He stood up, said his goodbyes to the group, and then started to clear his tray in the same way that he had done 100 times before. He had done this 100 times before. After entering the chamber through the same doors that he had used to enter, he exited the room and stepped out into the brisk air of January. As soon as he was outside, he made a sharp right-left and continued to walk the very short distance to the building that was located just next to the dining hall. Owen Hall was the name of the structure that housed the dormitory that was located here. Nevertheless, Wade did not live at Owen Hall as his residence hall. It turned out to be a separate building, which was known as Cary Quad West, and it was situated on the opposite side of the dining hall from the place where he resided. In spite of this, Wade was heading to Owen since he had some additional friends who lived there, and he was going there. First, he went into Owen Hall, then he went to the room where his companions were staying, and last he went into the room. Already present at the beginning of the weekend were a few people who were simply lounging around, engaged in discussion, and drinking a few alcoholic beverages. This was the beginning of the weekend. Wade sat down and had a few of drinks for himself in addition to joining them in their activity. It took him about an hour to simply hang out and catch up with everyone. He did this without doing anything else. The gathering that took place before the party was relaxed and unstructured in its mood. At that point, which was somewhere about 9:30 o'clock in the evening, the entire party arrived at the consensus that it was time to leave and head to the main event. In the direction of a major party that was being held at one of the organizations on campus, they left Owen Hall together and started walking approximately half a mile to the west, away from the core section of the school. They were heading in the direction of the party. For a considerable amount of time, Wade remained present at the fraternity celebration. During the time that he was simply having a wonderful time with his friends, the music was playing at a very loud volume, and the facility was entirely full. An idea, on the other hand, came to him at around midnight. He was immediately impressed by it. He went to one of his friends and told him that he had just recalled something that he had been thinking about. He then thanked him for his attention. It was discovered that he had left his jacket at the room of his friend in Owen Hall, which he had forgotten earlier. Despite the fact that it was a chilly evening, he had the want to go back to the spot and collect it. This was a clear and commonplace justification for leaving a party. It was the kind of thing that happens on a regular basis when people leave parties. However, this seemingly little action would set in motion a chain of bad and odd circumstances that would inevitably follow. The fact that all of the dormitories on the Purdue campus lock up at night for reasons of safety was one of the obstacles that needed to be overcome. The only way to access the building after a given hour is if you are a resident of that particular building and hold a keycard, or if you know someone who lives within the building and can physically unlock the door for you. If you do not meet either of these requirements, you will not be able to enter the facility. Wade could not simply swipe his way inside the building because he did not live in Owen Hall. This prevented him from entering the building. It was necessary for him to rely on one of his friends who lived there in order to acquire entry to the location. Therefore, as soon as he started walking back towards Owen Hall, he pulled out his mobile phone and began conversing on it till he reached his destination. Wade would make a total of 6 phone calls over the course of his journey, urgently trying to locate someone, anybody, in Owen Hall who would answer the door and open it for him. He would do this in an effort to find someone who would help him. However, despite his best efforts, he was not successful in accomplishing what he set out to do. It was a total of 4 calls that he made, 4 of which were to fictitious phone numbers. You are able to anticipate the confusion that he will feel. A person would answer the phone when he dialed the number, and he would ask them to let him into Owen Hall. He would do this again and again. On the other hand, the individual who answered the phone would not have any previous knowledge of the subject matter that he was discussing. They would hang up the phone after stating, "I'm sorry, you've got the wrong number," before saying the phrase. Additionally, he called 2 people who he was positive truly lived within Owen Hall. He was certain that they were resident there. Nevertheless, they did not answer their phones when they were phoned, and it is unclear what would have caused this. Maybe they had already gone to sleep, maybe they had their phones muted, or maybe they were still present at the party or other event. All of these possibilities are possible. Their phones continued to ring and ring until they reached the voicemail system, regardless of the circumstances that they were in. As a result of this, Wade went back to Owen Hall at about 12:30 inches the morning, having exhausted all of the options that were accessible to him. Then he approached the primary glass doors, which were now securely shut, and started hammering on them. However, they were still open. He took his phone out of his pocket and then reinserted it into his pocket a moment later. He was expecting that a local resident who was already inside would notice him and let him in. He had high hopes that this would happen. Additionally, in the end, it was finished by somebody. After hearing the banging, a student who lived in Owen Hall went to the door to see what was going on. They were curious about what was going on. This student was not someone Wade had ever encountered before, and Wade himself was not familiar with them. When the student peered through the glass, they saw Wade standing there. Wade was there. To phrase it another way, the student made a choice at that very instant in time. They were of the opinion that Wade was incapable of entering the building since he appeared to be under the influence of alcohol. It's possible that they were trying to follow the guidelines, but it's also possible that they simply did not want to be responsible for him. Both of these possibilities are possible. The decision that they made was to not allow him to enter. A tiny shake of the head was given by each of them as they stepped away from the entrance. Even though Wade remained to stand there for a short while longer, likely knocking a few more times in astonishment, he eventually just gave up and walked away. He had no chance of convincing himself otherwise. He then proceeded away from the doors and disappeared into the darkness after he had turned around and turned around again. Following the passage of a few days, we are now on the 16th of January, which is a Tuesday. After spending the lengthy weekend away from campus, Wade's roommate has finally made their way back to their dorm room in Cary Quad West. This comes after they had been absent for a considerable amount of time. His first observation was that there was no one else there in the room. He was the only person there. The absence of Wade was unmistakable. If he had not slept in his bed for at least a few days, it seemed as though he had not been there for quite some time. The roommate did not give it any attention when it first occurred to her that she might be committing the act. There is a possibility that Wade was either at the library or in class at the time. Nevertheless, as the hours passed and there was still no trace of him, a microscopic seed of anxiety began to become more and more obvious. This concern was growing in intensity. He attempted to contact Wade by calling him and sending him texts, but he did not encounter any reaction from him. There was no response to any of the texts that were sent, and all of the calls were forwarded to the voicemail system. The roommate's level of concern escalated, and she started asking other people on their floor whether or not they had seen Wade. She was concerned that Wade might have been hiding elsewhere. The reaction was consistent throughout the entire process. He had not been seen by anyone since Friday night, when he was last spotted. At this time, the anxiety had evolved into a legitimate alarm that needed to be addressed. After much deliberation, the roommate took the decision to communicate with Wade's family in the expectation that they would be aware of his whereabouts. There was a possibility that he had made the choice to spend the weekend at home without alerting anyone before making the decision. The moment he did eventually get the chance to talk to them, however, his heart sank. There was not a single member of Wade's family who was aware of his whereabouts. They were looking forward to hearing from him rather than hearing about him from other people. At the end of the day, the issue was glaringly obvious to everyone who was paying attention. After investigation, it was found that Wade Steffi had disappeared. This information was communicated to the authorities, and they immediately began working to address the matter. One of the first things that they did was contact Wade's mobile phone operator to inquire about the possibilities of tracking his phone. This was one of the first things that they began doing. It was possible for the provider to receive a signal from it while it was in operation. The fact that the phone was being utilized was a development that held a favorable significance. Unfortunately, the location was extremely vague, which was a turn of events that was not to be expected. But the one thing that they were able to prove was that Wade's mobile phone continued to be located somewhere on the enormous Purdue campus. This was the only thing that they were able to verify. Any place could have been the venue of the event. The evening of that day, a comprehensive search that included the entire campus was undertaken. I applaud the effort that you put forth in this matter. A significant number of law enforcement officials and volunteers carried out a comprehensive search that covered the entirety of the grounds of the university. The school's equestrian club, which consisted of pupils exploring the nearby fields and woodlands while mounted on horses, was also responsible for giving their involvement. They looked in every potential site where a person could be, they searched inside buildings, they searched in green locations, and they looked in every imaginable position. To the contrary, despite the enormous search effort that would continue for a number of weeks, very little was found. This was the case despite the fact that the search would continue. In order to establish Wade's existence, they would only find a single pair of his shoes when they searched for him. After only a little over 4 days after the beginning of the search, the shoe was found once more on the 20th of January. It was built in a location that was right outside of an exterior entry that went into a maintenance room for Owen Hall, which was situated inside the structure. This was a vital opportunity for the case to be broken, and it was taken advantage of. Owen Hall was the very last location that Wade attempted to access, and it was the site that he was unsuccessful. It appeared as though the discovery of his shoe just there was evidence that he had been in that particular location. Once they arrived, the detectives immediately concentrated their attention on the maintenance room as the first area they found themselves. Once they had opened the door, they began to conduct a thorough check of the area immediately surrounding it. Wade, on the other hand, was not even present. In spite of the fact that the area was nothing more than a utility compartment, there was no evidence to suggest that he had ever been inside. Despite the fact that the shoe was a clue, an impasse was reached as a result of the hint that led to the shoe. There seems to be no end to the weeks. Although the investigation continued, there was a growing sense of pessimism about the outcome. Following over a month of searching, the official search was finally called off. During that period, there were no fresh leads discovered, and Wade was nowhere to be seen. Finally, the search was called off. The fact that Wade's family and friends were in the dark about his death caused them to suffer in great sorrow. Recently, his disappearance had taken place on a college campus that was teeming with activity. After Wade had been reported missing for nearly 2 months, the inquiry took an unusual and unexpected turn on March 19, which was approximately 2 months later. The event took place on the 19th of March. One of the employees working in the maintenance department was carrying out his daily duties in the laundry room that was situated in the basement of Owen Hall. While he was working, he became aware of an odd sound that was coming over. An unmistakable popping sound could be heard. Initially, the worker did not have a great deal of anxiety regarding the matter. Through his deductions, he came to the conclusion that the source of the noise was most likely one of the dryers or the washing machines. Inside of a machine, there was a coin that was scattered around or a button made of metal that was being mixed up. Both of these things were loose. Within the confines of a laundry room, it was a disturbance that was heard rather frequently. He continued with his task, but one moment later, he was confronted with yet another hearing of it. What a pop! The following time, he made the choice to investigate the matter further. He started moving around the laundry room, pausing at regular intervals to pay close attention to each of the machines that were functioning in an effort to locate the source of the noise. He was trying to determine where the noise was coming from. During this time, he once again heard the popping sound. However, this time it was abundantly clear that the sound was not coming from any of the washers or dryers or any other device. He was able to positively identify the source of the sound. The fact of the situation is that it was not actually coming from within the laundry room at all. This is the genuine reality. It originated from a point that was not in close proximity to the entrance of the hall. The worker entered the corridor after developing a sense of curiosity, which led him to leave the washing room and proceed to enter the corridor. When he had finished standing there in the tranquil ambiance of the corridor that led down to the basement, he heard the pop once more. At this point, it was much simpler to comprehend. This time, the sound was coming from behind the locked door that was located directly across from the laundry room, and it was clear that it was coming from that particular location. After taking out his enormous ring of keys, the worker found the key that was suitable with the lock, and then he released it. This allowed him to unlock the door that was directly in front of him. He went inside in order to gain access. After a few moments had passed, he would have a realization that would be quite upsetting. We are now in a position to reconstruct the specific events that took place with Wade Steffi during the early morning hours of January 13th. This is made possible by the fact that this discovery was made, as well as the subsequent study that was carried out. Wade did not simply leave the building after being denied entrance into Owen Hall, nor did he simply walk away from the building after the student refused to unlock the door because they believed he was too intoxicated. Both of these events occurred after Wade was denied access into Owen Hall. In his determination to collect his jacket, he had not wavered in the least. As a consequence of this, he left the building by the front doors and then found his way to the left side of the structure where he looked for an alternative access point. During the course of his exploration of the building, he came across an additional entrance. It should come as no surprise that the pupils were not supposed to get access through this particular entryway. Although there was no sign on it that proclaimed "Keep Out," it was extremely obvious when it was present. This was the case even though there was no official notice. There was no question in anyone's mind that the metal railing that was installed along the exterior of this door was there for the sole purpose of preventing people from even coming close to making contact with it. By itself, the door was not built at ground level. It was erected by someone else. Construction was carried out in the basement, where it was positioned into a concrete pit for the purpose of construction. In order for you to go up to it, you would have to first jump down into this pit and then climb over the safety barrier. This would be essential. Because this door was constantly locked, it was essential to acquire a key in order to get entry to it by any means required. This door could only be accessed by going through the building, which was the correct way there. In contrast, it was predetermined that this would be the outcome. Despite the fact that Wade was under the influence of alcohol at the time, he did not perceive any danger when he came upon this entrance on the side of Owen Hall that was definitely off limits. He was aware of a problem that could arise. In light of the fact that he believed it would be an excellent notion, he made the decision to attempt to get in this method. As far as he was concerned, the events that were taking place behind the door were of no consequence to him. If he were to get inside a piece of Owen Hall, he reasoned, he would be able to find his way up to his friend's room and reclaim his jacket. He would be able to do this if he could just sneak inside. As a consequence of this, he raced straight toward the railing. Following his ascent over it, he made a hasty descent into the small concrete hole that was situated below. As soon as he landed in front of the door, he stretched out and grabbed the doorknob, and then he began working on it. His surprise was compounded by the fact that it was fully open. There was no lock located on it. Upon entering the room, he was the one who opened the door and entered. Immediately after that, he was completely and utterly enveloped in darkness, beginning at that very moment. The buzzing and churning of machines all around him was the only sound he could hear in the darkness. That was the only sound he could hear. The rest of the world was also silent. Even though he was under the influence of alcohol, he was able to return to the realization that this was still a good strategy. The fact that he was unable to find a light switch was the only reason why he was actually concerned about the situation. It was so dark inside that he was worried that if the door closed behind him, not only would his one and only source of light be cut off, but the door would actually lock, so confining him inside this peculiar space that was gloomy. He was anxious about this because the temperature inside was so low. With that in mind, he came up with an easy solution to the issue. Kneeling down, removing one of his shoes, and tucking it into the door jamb were the steps he took in order to successfully prop the door open. A sliver of light from the outside was able to penetrate the chamber as a result of the door being propped open behind him. He then began to advance further into the area as a result of this. After that, he was involved in a collision with a massive metal structure. This took place almost quickly after that. Due to the fact that it was still too dark, he was unable to see what it was, yet he was strongly aware of its presence. It was a metal structure that was flat and appeared to be a massive cabinet or a machine of some kind. The object was something that was flat. Upon hearing the buzzing and whirring sound, he was able to discover that it was one of the machines that was responsible for making the sound. Recently, he came to the conclusion that he would make an effort to walk around everything. His objective was straightforward. He needed to go through this room, find another door on the opposite side, and then continue his journey up into the dormitory. He intended to do all of these things. Wade moved his hand all the way along the edge of the machine as he began to go toward the left side of the machine. He was under the assumption that the machine had to stop working at some point in order for him to be able to go around it. This machine, on the other hand, turned out to be exceedingly enormous and incredibly wide from the beginning. When he eventually reached the left edge of it, he was so close to the wall of the room that he was almost touching it. He was in such close proximity to the wall. Upon his arrival, he became aware of the fact that the space that existed between the side of the machine and the wall of the chamber was only slightly larger than what would allow a human to pass through. This realization came to him almost immediately. If he turned his body to the side, there is a chance that he possesses the ability to make it. Despite the fact that he was not sure of the precise distance that this odd gadget traveled back into the room, he was of the opinion that it was a good idea. In order to accomplish this, he arranged himself in such a way that his chest was facing the machine and his back was against the wall of the room. The next thing he did was begin the process of forcing himself into the limited space within the room. He was holding his hands up in a manner that was comparable to protecting his face and neck from whatever was in front of him while he was slowly making his way through. He was doing this while he was slowly making his way through. A further point to consider is that at some point in time, while he was strolling by himself, he began to trip. This tight space between the machine and the wall saved him from actually falling. Yet, for a split second, he reflexively stretched out with his hands to support himself on the machine that was directly in front of him. He was essentially trapped into this narrow area between the machine and the wall. Moreover, his left ring finger was able to fit into a very small hole on the face of the machine, which was around 2 inches deep. This was a very fortunate occurrence. This terrible accident was brought about by nothing more than random occurrence. In the room that Wade was presently using for himself, the name of the room was an electrical vault. Additionally, it was outfitted with 6 large transformers that were of a high power. The machine that his finger had just become stuck inside of was one of the machines that he pointed to. What you saw was the machine. These 6 transformers were tasked with the obligation of transforming the extremely high voltage that they acquired from the major power grid into a lesser voltage that could be employed. This was the responsibility that they were tasked with. After that, this voltage was dispersed throughout Owen Hall in order to supply electricity to the lights, outlets, and everything else that was located throughout the building. Even though the majority of the exterior of these transformers had been covered with protective materials in order to lessen the likelihood of electrocution, there were still a few locations of these devices in which there was just nothing that could be done to prevent electrocution from occurring. It was quite likely that they would get electrocuted, which was a possible risk that they posed. When working with it, you needed to exercise extra caution since the hole that Wade's finger had just fallen into was 2 inches deep. This was one of those parts that required you to be extra careful. At the back of that particular hole, there was an exposed electrical conductor that was located. As soon as the tip of his finger made contact with that conductor, a rush of electricity ranging from 2,000 to 4,000 volts was shot into his body. For the purpose of providing a point of comparison, the electric chair is frequently utilized for the purpose of executing individuals, and the voltage that is typically utilized to electrocute them is 2,000 volts. It is widely believed that Wade passed away instantly. However, his body did not just fall to the ground as he died away because he was crushed up against the wall and the transformer in such a way that it was so closely packed together. This caused his body to be pressed up against both of these objects. But he proceeded to keep himself in a position that was just partially upright, with his finger still stuck inside that hole. He did this for a considerable amount of time. From that moment forward, his body continued to be electrocuted at every single second of every single day for the coming 2 months. This occurred until the month of February. At some point during the month of March, Wade's body fluids started to drain out of him, which caused the electrical current that was being pumped into him to shift its path despite the fact that it had been flowing in the other direction since the beginning of the month. A sound that sounded like it was cracking or arcing could be heard emanating from beyond his body and into the base of the earth. When the maintenance worker heard the popping sound coming from the laundry room, he knew it was originating from there. Specifically, it was the sound of the electrical current making contact with the ground. One of the only other entrances that led into the electrical vault was the door that the maintenance guy opened in order to investigate the sound. This was the only other entry that led into the vault. Nevertheless, the door that Wade had used to enter the facility was the door that led to the exterior of the structure. Upon opening the door to the interior and taking a quick look inside, the worker did not first observe Wade. He did not even notice him at first. On the other side, he had the unpleasant experience of smelling something that was rather strange. Because of this, he proceeded to advance further into the area and navigate his way around the various pieces of equipment that were there. It was at that very moment when he became aware of Wade's lifeless carcass. The shoe that Wade was wearing had at some point in time escaped from the door jamb when it was discovered by the police earlier on January 26. Wade was wearing the shoe at the time. At the time that it was found, it was no longer doing its job of keeping the door to the outside open. Within that pit area, it was just sitting there, and the door that led to the outside compartment was shut and secured. When the shoe was found, the law enforcement officers did in fact go into the electrical vault to retrieve the shoe. They did not, on the other hand, enter through the entrance that was located off the street. They navigated their way around and approached the internal entry that was identical to the one that the maintenance worker will use in the future. The laundry house was located just across the hall from this door, which was the one that was in question. And when they opened it, all they did was look into the room from the entrance, but they did not actually go inside. They did not walk all the way into the room when they entered it with their feet. During the process of shining their flashlights around the area, they became aware of the transformers and identified them. Wade's name was called out during this time. This was due to the fact that they were standing in the doorway, which prevented them from seeing him from their vantage point. It was impossible to see his body because of the large transformer that he was packed behind. This made it tough to recognize him. Consequently, this was the reason why they had previously indicated that Wade had not been present in that room throughout the entire time. The error was a bad one that was brought about by an angle that was just impossible to achieve. In the end, the investigation came to the realization that the door that connects to the exterior of the electrical vault was intended to be entirely secured at all times. This was the overall conclusion that was reached. It is quite clear that this was not the situation as a result of Wade's participation in the discussion. As a consequence of this, it was finally determined that Purdue University had engaged in negligent behavior. The parties came to an agreement that they would pay Wade's family a total of $500,000. This was the settlement that was reached. They also established a scholarship in Wade's name, which assured that his memory would be carried on by aiding other outstanding students in following their dreams at the university where Wade's life was cut so tragically short for no apparent reason. The story was one of a string of catastrophes that got progressively worse. There was a series of seemingly insignificant choices that were made on a typical Friday night, such as forgetting the jacket, not answering the phone calls, and deciding to find another way to enter, but finally led to a tragic and avoidable end. These choices included everything from forgetting the jacket to not answering the phone calls. I want to express my gratitude for your presence here today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would appreciate it if you could share your ideas with me in the comments area. Also, bear in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime waiting for you to watch in one sitting right now. You may watch all of these episodes in one sitting till the next time we meet again. What's going on? On the morning of September 23, 1839, an experienced sailor named Captain Brighton stood on the freezing, ice-slick deck of his ship. His vessel was currently navigating the treacherous waters of the Drake Passage, a notoriously dangerous stretch of ocean located right along the northern coast of Antarctica. Brighton and his crew had sailed all the way to this remote and hostile part of the world because they were professional whalers. They had heard rumors from other sailors that there was a massive, completely untouched population of whales in the Drake Passage. Because almost nobody was brave enough to sail this far south, the whales here had never been hunted, and a successful voyage could make Captain Brighton and his men incredibly wealthy. But this was a freezing, bitter, and completely isolated part of the world. It was a place where help would never come if something went wrong, making it an extremely dangerous place to be. And so far, the voyage had been a complete disaster. They had been sailing through the icy waters for days, and they had not spotted a single whale. The crew was getting restless, and the mood on the ship was growing more tense with every passing hour. To make matters worse, the Drake Passage had proven to be just as dangerous as everyone had warned. Just the previous night, the temperature had plummeted to unprecedented levels, and the ocean water around their ship had literally frozen solid. Within hours, the ship was completely anchored in place by a massive sheet of ice. When this happened, Captain Brighton realized that there was absolutely nothing they could do. They were stuck. If the ice did not break up soon, they would be trapped there for the entire winter, and it was highly unlikely that they had enough food or fuel to survive the freezing darkness. The crew members began to mutter among themselves, questioning if they would ever see their homes again. One of the older sailors told the captain that they should turn back as soon as possible, but the captain knew they had already spent so much of their resources to get here that returning empty-handed would mean complete financial ruin for everyone on board. But fortunately, late that same night, a massive storm rolled in. In any other situation, a violent storm in the Antarctic would be a terrifying event that could easily tear a ship apart. But for Captain Brighton and his crew, the severity of the storm was actually a blessing in disguise. The powerful waves and howling winds broke up the thick sheet of ice surrounding the ship, allowing them to finally sail away. And so, on that morning of September 23rd, the ocean was once again liquid, and the ship was able to move. But Captain Brighton now faced a very difficult decision. They had invested an incredible amount of time, money, and effort to get out here, and so far, they had absolutely nothing to show for it. But he also knew that if they stayed in the Drake Passage much longer, they could easily get trapped in the ice again, and next time they might not be so lucky. He had to decide whether to push further into the dangerous passage to find whales or to turn back and sail north before it was too late. He paced back and forth on the deck, looking at the gray sky, trying to find an answer. But as Captain Brighton stood on the deck, weighing his options, he suddenly noticed something strange over the horizon. There was a dark, silent shape drifting in the distance. At first, he actually thought he was hallucinating because the cold and the stress were starting to get to him. There was absolutely nothing out here but ocean, ice, and sky. But as he continued to stare through his spyglass in the direction of this dark object, which was slowly getting closer to them, he realized it was indeed a real ship. His first instinct was that it had to be a rival whaling ship because they were the only people crazy enough to sail in these waters. But as the vessel drifted closer, he realized it was not a whaler at all. It was a schooner, which was a type of ship designed for travel and transport, not for hunting whales. And as Captain Brighton stared at the schooner, he could see that it was in terrible shape. The sails were torn and tattered, flapping uselessly in the cold wind, and the entire hull of the ship was covered in a thick layer of ice. There was something deeply unsettling about the way it was drifting aimlessly, with no smoke coming from the galley chimney and no signs of activity on the deck. But Captain Brighton was a good man, and he knew how easy it was to get trapped in the ice out here. He thought that perhaps this crew had been stuck in the frozen water for weeks or months, and that they might be starving, injured, or in desperate need of assistance. He knew that his own ship had some extra supplies to spare, so he called out to his men to ready a small dinghy and pack some blankets, food, and water. He and 4 of his strongest sailors hopped into the dinghy and began rowing across the cold, choppy water toward the silent schooner. The waves were rough, tossing their small boat up and down, but they slowly made progress. The freezing spray hit their faces, and the cold was biting, but they kept rowing. As they got closer to the tattered ship, Brighton looked up and peered through the small glass portholes on the side of the hull. Through the frost-covered glass, he could clearly see the shapes of people inside the ship. They appeared to be sitting and standing in different rooms. Brighton called out a few times, shouting into the wind, but the air was loud and cold, and he couldn't tell if anyone heard him or if anyone was calling back. Eventually, they reached the side of the schooner, threw a rope over, and climbed up the wooden ladder to board the ship. When they stepped onto the deck, they found that everything was completely silent. The deck was covered in a thick layer of white frost, and the sails creaked in the wind, but there was no sign of life. Even though they had seen people through the portholes, there was absolutely nobody above deck. Brighton thought this was incredibly strange, but he figured that the crew must be huddled inside to stay warm, perhaps resting or waiting for help. He and his men walked across the tattered deck to the door that led into the captain's quarters. Brighton knocked loudly on the heavy wood and called out, announcing that they were friendly whalers who had brought supplies and wanted to make sure everyone was okay. But there was no answer. The only sound was the water slapping against the side of the ship and the wind howling through the rigging. It was completely silent on the ship. Slowly, Captain Brighton reached out, turned the handle, and pushed the door open. He stepped into the dark, freezing cabin. In the back of the room, there was a large wooden desk, and a man was sitting in a chair behind it, his back turned to the door. He was hunched over, holding a pen in his hand, as if he was in the middle of writing in a journal. Brighton took a cautious step forward and called out to the man, assuming he was the captain of the ship. But the man did not move or speak. He remained perfectly still, focused on the desk in front of him. Brighton exchanged a worried glance with his men and decided to walk across the room to physically check on him and see what was going on. As he got closer, Brighton noticed that the air in the cabin was so cold that he could see his own breath, but the man at the desk was not shivering. Brighton reached out and gently touched the man's shoulder. The shoulder was hard as rock. The man was frozen solid. Brighton looked down at the desk and read what the man had been writing in his journal. The handwriting was neat, but the words were heartbreaking. The entry read, "Trapped by icebergs. Despite all efforts, the fire went out last night. No hope remains." But the most terrifying part of the journal was not the message itself. It was the date written right above it. The entry was dated January 17th, 1823. Captain Brighton and his crew stood in absolute paralyzed shock. It was currently September of 1839. This meant that the captain of the ship and everyone else on board had been dead for 16 years. They had gotten trapped in the ice just like Brighton's ship had, but their ice had never broken up. They had been stranded in the freezing cold, and when their fuel ran out, they had all frozen to death. Because the Antarctic air was so incredibly cold and dry, their bodies had not decayed. Instead, they had been perfectly preserved, frozen in the exact positions they were in when they died. In a state of pure horror, Brighton and his men began to search the rest of the ship. In the main cabin, they found a group of men sitting around a wooden table. They were holding playing cards in their hands, their frozen eyes staring blankly at each other, looking as if they had died in the middle of a game. In another cabin, they found a woman lying in her bed, her arms wrapped tightly around a small dog. Both of them were frozen solid, looking as if they had just fallen asleep. In the dining hall, other crew members were sitting upright at tables, frozen in place as if they were waiting for a meal that never came. They had been floating as a ghost ship, a silent, frozen tomb, drifting through the lonely waters of the Drake Passage for nearly 2 decades. Nobody had found them, and they had simply drifted with the ocean currents, perfectly preserved in time. Terrified by the haunting scene, Captain Brighton and his men ran back to their dinghy, rowed as fast as they could back to their own ship, and immediately set sail for the north. They left the frozen schooner to drift alone in the icy darkness, a chilling reminder of the cold, quiet power of the sea. It is truly terrifying how the cold can freeze a moment in time, preserving a tragedy for years. But sometimes, the most horrific events do not come from the cold of the ocean, but from the heat of panic and fear in our own minds. When we are placed in a dark, unfamiliar place, our brains can play tricks on us, turning normal, harmless things into terrifying monsters. And when we react to those imaginary monsters, the consequences can be incredibly real and tragic. This is exactly what happened on the night of May 20th, 1958, in eastern India. A young man named Ram Thapa was walking down a dark road toward the entrance of an abandoned airport. He was trailing closely behind 3 other men. These men were his boss, another employee, and a close friend of his boss. The night was pitch black, with no moonlight to illuminate the road, so all 4 men were carrying flashlights to guide their way. But Ram also had something else. Hidden beneath his clothes, he had a large, heavy knife. The reason they were at this abandoned airport was because Ram's boss, a wealthy businessman, was considering buying the property to expand his business. The airport had been built during World War II, but had been abandoned for many years. The metal hangars were rusted, the buildings were overgrown with weeds, and the runway was cracked and silent. But because the airport had been abandoned for so long, the local villagers began to whisper that the property was haunted. They claimed that the spirits of dead soldiers and travelers wandered the runway at night, and that the old buildings were infested with restless ghosts. Ram, who was a very traditional and superstitious young man, believed these stories completely. He was terrified of the spiritual world and believed that trespassing on haunted ground was an invitation for disaster. However, Ram's boss did not believe in ghosts. He thought the local rumors were ridiculous, and he wanted to go inspect the property at night to see if it was worth buying. He decided to turn the inspection into a ghost hunt, and he forced Ram and the other men to come along. Ram had begged his boss not to go, warning him that they were disrespecting the spirits, but the boss had laughed and told him that if he did not come, he would be fired. So Ram was there, but he was paralyzed with fear. He had brought the heavy knife along to protect himself from the ghosts, fully believing that he might have to fight for his life. When they reached the rusty iron gate of the airport, the boss unlocked it and pushed it open. The gate made a loud, echoing, creaking sound as it swung open, and for the first time, the men had an unobstructed view of the dark, silent property. It was completely pitch black. They shone their flashlights inside, but all they could see were the massive, dark shapes of old hangars and the broken-down hulls of old planes. Nothing was moving. It was completely quiet. The boss and the other two men began walking onto the property, talking and laughing, completely relaxed. But Ram was walking at the very back of the group, and he felt physically sick to his stomach. Every time the wind rustled the tall weeds, or a shadow shifted in the beam of his flashlight, Ram was convinced that a ghost was staring back at him. His heart was pounding, and his hand was tightly gripping the handle of the knife under his coat. Eventually, the group reached the edge of the long, empty runway. Instead of shining their flashlights straight ahead, the boss and his friends began shining their lights off to the side, pointing at a massive hangar and discussing its structure. They were completely focused on the building. But Ram, trembling with fear, slowly aimed his flashlight straight out in front of them, down the long, empty runway. And then, his heart stopped. About 200 meters away, just off the side of the runway, there was a glowing, floating orb of light. Immediately, Ram kept his flashlight locked on the light. He nudged his boss and whispered for them to look. The other men stopped talking and turned their flashlights in the same direction. They all saw it. The floating orb of light was real. And as they watched, they noticed that there was not just this orb of light, but there was something below the orb of light. On the ground, something was moving. This grayish figure, or multiple figures, were kind of moving around right beneath this orb. But before any of them could say or do anything or react really in any way to whatever it was they were looking at, the dark figures right below the orb, as they were being illuminated by all their flashlights, it was like, all of a sudden, whatever they were, they turned, and all these eyes glinted and looked directly back at Ram and his colleagues. In that exact moment, something inside of Ram's mind clicked. He was so scared. He had been terrified from the moment they arrived at the gate, and his mind was completely primed to believe that they were in danger of a supernatural attack. When he saw those glinting eyes staring at him from the darkness, he did not see human beings. He saw evil, demonic spirits. He was convinced that these monsters were about to attack them and drag them into the darkness, and that if he did not act immediately, they would all be killed. Without saying a word to his boss or the other men, Ram drew his heavy knife and took off running down the runway toward the figures, screaming at the top of his lungs. He didn't think about his job, his safety, or the consequences of his actions. All he knew was that he had to destroy the monsters before they could destroy him. But the tragedy was that those figures were not ghosts or demons. They were 3 local women who had snuck onto the airfield that night. They had come to collect wildflowers and herbs that grew near the runway, which they believed had special medicinal properties when gathered under the cover of night. The floating orb of light was simply their oil lantern. Before the women could even understand what was happening, Ram burst out of the darkness and began wildly swinging his knife. In his state of absolute terror, he believed he was fighting for his life against supernatural monsters. He stabbed one of the women repeatedly, killing her on the spot, and severely wounded the other 2 women, leaving them bleeding on the cold concrete. The boss and the other men finally ran down the runway, tackled Ram to the ground, and disarmed him. A few hours later, the men were no longer at the airport. Instead, they were at the local police station, and Ram was in handcuffs. When the detectives finally sat him down and explained what had actually happened, when they told him that the demons he thought he was fighting were actually just innocent women picking flowers, Ram was completely devastated. The realization of his horrible mistake crushed him, and he wept uncontrollably, realizing that he had taken an innocent life. Ram was charged with murder and assault. However, when he went on trial, the jury heard extensive testimony about his deep superstitions and the intense panic he had experienced that night. They realized that he had not acted out of anger or malice, but out of a genuine, overwhelming belief that he was defending himself and his friends from a supernatural threat. The jury ultimately acquitted him of all charges, ruling that he was not legally responsible for his actions due to his mental state. But even though he was a free man, the guilt of what he had done remained a heavy, painful burden that he had to carry for the rest of his life. It is deeply tragic how fear can distort our perception of the world, turning innocent people into monsters in our minds. But sometimes, This distortion does not just affect one person. Sometimes a shared belief, a shared fear, can spread through a group of people, twisting their reality until they all descend into a collective nightmare. This is the phenomenon of mass hysteria, and when it takes hold of a family, the results can be truly horrifying. This is what happened in Kaohsiung City, Taiwan, in April of 2005. A young man was home alone inside of his apartment, sitting on his couch and watching TV. As he sat there, he suddenly heard a loud, heavy thumping sound coming from the ceiling directly above him. As soon as he heard it, he muted his TV and listened closely. A minute later, he heard the sound again, a loud, heavy thump. And then he heard another one, and another, and another. Before long, the ceiling was vibrating with a continuous succession of heavy thumps, accompanied by what sounded like frantic, loud chanting coming from upstairs. To the average person, these sounds would be incredibly alarming. But to this young man, they were actually not that unusual. The family that lived in the apartment directly above him, the Wu family, were known to be very eccentric and deeply religious. They often performed traditional ceremonial dances and rituals in their home at all hours of the day and night. A lot of times, these rituals involved stomping around on the floor and chanting loudly. Even though the noise could be highly annoying, the young man had never complained. He was a polite and respectful neighbor, and he felt that their religious practices were none of his business. So, like he did every other time they started their rituals, he simply turned up the volume on his TV and tried to forget about the noise. But after a few minutes, the noises coming from upstairs began to get louder and louder until the floorboards were literally shaking. It was completely impossible to ignore. And then, suddenly, he heard a scream coming from upstairs. It was a high-pitched, agonizing scream of pure terror. It did not sound like it was part of a ceremony. It sounded like someone was in extreme danger, or was being seriously hurt. The young man turned his TV off and stood up, his heart beating fast. He decided that he had to go upstairs and make sure everyone was okay. But just as he started walking toward his front door, all the noises upstairs suddenly stopped. The entire building became completely silent. The young man stood by his door, listening intently, waiting to see if the noise or the screaming would start again. But there was nothing. It was dead quiet. He assumed that the ceremony had simply ended, so he turned around, walked back to his couch, and turned the TV back on. 2 days later, on April 11th, the same young man was back home, watching TV yet again, when once again he heard a loud pounding sound. But this time, the sound was not coming from the apartment upstairs. It was coming from his own front door. Someone was frantically hammering on his door, trying to get his attention. The young man turned off his TV, got up, and went to the door. He opened it up, and standing there on the landing was Wu Shan, the father and patriarch of the Wu family. Wu Shan looked absolutely horrific. He was dressed in black from head to toe, but he was incredibly pale, skinny, and gaunt, as if he had not eaten or slept in days. He was covered in what looked like filth, ash, and a sticky, dark substance. But the most shocking part was the smell. A putrid, overwhelming stench of waste and decay was coming off him, so strong that the young man had to take a step back just to breathe. The young man looked at him in shock and asked if everything was okay, remembering the loud screams he had heard 2 days before. But Wu Shan just stared back at him with a blank, hollow expression. He did not explain what was happening. He simply muttered, "Call an ambulance." And then, without saying another word, Wu Shan turned around, ran down the stairs, and disappeared out into the street. The young man was left standing there, completely stunned and confused. Wu Shan had looked terrible, and now he had run away. The young man thought about the bizarre ritual and the screams he had heard 2 days ago, and now he was being told to call an ambulance. He decided that before he did anything, he needed to go upstairs and see what was going on inside the Wu family's apartment. He left his apartment, walked up the stairs, and stood outside the Wu family's door. Even standing in the hallway, he could smell that same putrid, disgusting odor that had been on Wu Shan. He knocked on the door, covering his nose with his shirt, but there was no response. Nobody came to the door. He tried the door handle and found that it was unlocked. Apprehensively, but knowing that someone might be seriously hurt, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Immediately, he was hit by a massive wave of the most disgusting smell he had ever encountered. It was so strong that he could barely breathe, but he forced himself to take a few steps into the apartment. The walls and floors were covered in dirt, grime, and some kind of dark filth. He called out, asking if anyone was home, but nobody answered. He walked through the hallway and made his way into the living room. And there, he stopped, completely frozen by a sight that he could not believe. Lying in the middle of the living room floor was the eldest daughter of the Wu family. She was dead, her body covered in filth, her face pale and lifeless. When the police arrived and began to investigate, they uncovered a story of shared madness and horror that shocked the entire country. It turned out that a few weeks before, the eldest daughter had fallen ill. The family did not have a lot of money, so they were unable to take her to a doctor. As her condition got worse, they began to believe that her sickness was not a physical ailment, but a spiritual one. They became convinced that she had been possessed by a powerful, malevolent demon. They began performing ceremonies to ward off the demon, but she did not get better. The constant stress, fear, and isolation inside the small apartment began to affect the rest of the family. The delusion began to spread. Soon, the other family members began to believe that they too were being possessed by the same demon. This is a rare psychological phenomenon known as mass hysteria, or folie plusieurs, where a group of closely related people share the exact same severe delusion. By April 9th, the entire family was in a state of absolute panic. They believed they were in a battle for their souls, and they decided that they had to perform a massive group exorcism. But the method they chose for this exorcism was truly horrifying. In their twisted, delusional minds, they believed that the one thing demons feared most was filth. They believed that if they filled their bodies with enough disgusting waste, the demons would find their bodies uninhabitable and would be forced to leave. And so, during the loud, chaotic ritual that the neighbor had heard, the family began to consume their own feces and urine. They forced each other to swallow the waste, chanting and stomping to ward off the spirits. When their bodies naturally rejected the waste and they vomited, they would force themselves to swallow it again. They did this for hours and hours, screaming and crying in agony. The screams the neighbor had heard were the sounds of this horrific, self-inflicted torture. The eldest daughter, who was already weak from her illness, could not survive the physical trauma of the ritual. She choked on her own vomit and waste, and her airway became completely blocked. She suffocated and died right there on the living room floor, while her family, still lost in their shared madness, believed the demon was finally leaving her body. For 2 whole days, the family lived in the apartment with her body, continuing their rituals until the physical exhaustion finally wore off and Wushan realized what had happened. He fled the apartment, told the neighbor to call an ambulance, and ran. The police eventually tracked down and arrested all the surviving family members, charging them with the daughter's death. But during the trial, medical and psychiatric experts testified that the family was suffering from a severe, acute episode of mass hysteria. They were completely disconnected from reality and genuinely believed they were saving their daughter's life. The court ultimately decided that they were not legally responsible for their actions due to their severe mental state. They were acquitted of all charges and sent to a psychiatric hospital for long-term treatment. These 3 stories, spanning different centuries, cultures, and continents, show us the incredible power and fragility of the human mind. Whether it is a seasoned sea captain finding a frozen crew lost 16 years ago, a young man driven to a tragic act of violence by his fear of the supernatural, or a family consumed by a shared, horrifying delusion, the consequences of our deepest fears are all too real. They leave us with a haunting reminder of how fragile our minds truly are, and how easily the line between what is real and what we fear can disappear in the dark. To look closely at these cases is to understand how easily belief can become a cage. In the frozen expanse of the Antarctic, The captain of the Jenny died, believing there was absolutely no hope, and for 16 years his words waited in the dark to be read. In the empty fields of India, a young man was so convinced he was protecting his friends from demons that he took the life of a woman who was only picking flowers. And in Taiwan, a family was so desperate to save their daughter from a spiritual illness that they subjected her to a ritual that ended her life. The tragedy in each story is not that monsters existed, but that the human mind is capable of creating them out of nothing but thin air, dark thoughts, and isolated places. In the end, we are left to wonder how much of our own reality is shaped by what we believe rather than what is actually there. The physical places where these events took place have mostly gone back to normal. The waters of the Drake Passage still freeze and thaw, the abandoned airfield in India remains quiet under the stars, and the apartment building in Kaohsiung is still home to people who live quiet lives. But the memories of those who survived, and the stories of those who did not, linger on like ghosts of their own. They serve as a powerful warning that sometimes the most dangerous things we will ever encounter are not waiting for us in the outside world, but are lurking inside the deepest corners of our own minds. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think about these stories in the comments. And if you're not ready to leave just yet, there are plenty more true stories waiting for you right here. In the 1960s and 1970s, hitchhiking became incredibly popular among young people across America. It was a time defined by a spirit of counterculture, exploration, and a widespread sense of communal trust. Hitchhiking was viewed as a normal, socially acceptable, and highly efficient form of alternative transportation. The mechanics of it were simple and universally understood. A traveler would stand on the side of a busy highway, extend their arm, and hold their thumb upward to signal passing motorists that they needed a ride. If a driver felt inclined to help, they would pull over to the shoulder, the hitchhiker would hop into the vehicle, and they would set off toward a shared destination. Today, the idea of getting into a car with a complete stranger, or conversely, picking up an unknown person from the side of the road, seems unfathomably dangerous. Modern society views the practice with intense skepticism shaped by decades of cautionary tales. But in the late 1970s, it was still considered a routine way for a young person to travel across the vast expanses of the United States. It was with this mindset that 15-year-old Mary Vincent found herself standing on the side of a highway just outside of Modesto, California, on the 29th of September, 1978. Modesto was a city located in California's Central Valley, not terribly far from the bustling hub of San Francisco. Mary was a rebellious, fiercely independent teenager who had recently run away from her family home in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her parents were going through an incredibly bitter, hostile, and exhausting divorce, and the atmosphere inside her house had become entirely unbearable for her. Desperate to escape the emotional turmoil and constant arguments, Mary decided to leave. She used the universal network of hitchhiking to travel all the way from Las Vegas down to Los Angeles, California, where her grandfather lived. However, after spending just a couple of days at her grandfather's home, the reality of her situation began to set in. The initial adrenaline of running away faded, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating wave of homesickness. Despite the chaos of her parents' crumbling marriage, Mary deeply missed her family, her siblings, and the comfort of the familiar. She desperately wanted to return to Las Vegas. One afternoon, while her grandfather was out of the house running errands, Mary decided to act on her feelings. She quietly slipped out of his home, carrying a small bag of personal belongings, and headed toward the highway to begin the long journey back to Nevada. Hitchhiking alone as a teenage girl was difficult and slow, but Mary managed to secure a series of rides that brought her northward from Los Angeles up to Modesto. The drivers who had helped her so far were ordinary, decent people who simply wanted to assist a traveling teenager. By the time she reached Modesto, she was positioned on a stretch of highway looking for another vehicle that could take her farther south and east back toward Las Vegas. On this particular afternoon, Mary was not entirely alone. She had grouped up with two other young hitchhikers who were also trying to travel down the coast. Together, the three teenagers stood in a small huddle on the shoulder of the road. To make their intentions completely clear to passing motorists, they were holding up cardboard signs that boldly read, "Going South." They hoped that traveling as a group would make them look safer and perhaps encourage a driver with a larger vehicle to pick them all up. In the middle of the afternoon, a light blue passenger van slowed down as it approached the trio. The van belonged to a man who appeared to be in his 50s. He looked completely ordinary, harmless, and unthreatening, the kind of older man who easily blended into a crowd. Seeing their signs, the driver pulled the van over to the side of the highway, parking about 15 feet ahead of where the teenagers were standing. Mary's two companions stayed back, waiting to see what the driver would say, while Mary eagerly ran forward to initiate the conversation. She walked up to the passenger side of the van, where the window had already been rolled down. Looking inside, she saw that the driver was alone, and the back of the van was completely wide open, offering plenty of space. Mary politely addressed the man, asking if he would be willing to give all three of them a ride, since they were all heading south. The man looked directly at Mary and shook his head. He replied in a calm but firm voice, stating that he could only give her a ride and that he would not accommodate the other two teenagers. Mary felt an immediate wave of confusion and hesitation. She looked past him into the interior of the light blue van, noting the abundance of empty space. There were no large boxes, no extra passengers, and no obvious reasons why three teenagers couldn't easily fit inside. She gently prodded the man, asking him if he was absolutely sure he couldn't take her friends along, emphasizing that they were all traveling to the exact same area. The man did not offer a complex explanation. He simply repeated himself with chilling finality, making it clear that he would take her, but he absolutely would not take the others. Sensing that this was her only immediate option, Mary told the driver to wait for a moment while she retrieved her bag. She walked back to her two companions and explained the driver's strict condition. Her friends instantly grew alarmed. They told Mary that something felt incredibly wrong about the situation. They pointed out that a normal, well-meaning driver with an empty van would have no logical reason to refuse two extra passengers who were heading in the exact same direction. They explicitly warned her not to get into the vehicle, sensing an unspoken danger. Mary harbored her own internal reservations. A small, quiet voice in her mind told her that her friends were right. But her intense desire to get home completely clouded her judgment. She was so deeply homesick, so physically exhausted from days of traveling, and so desperate to see her parents that she could not bear the thought of waiting on the highway shoulder for another night. She knew that not every driver was willing to pick up hitchhikers, and she feared that if she turned this ride down, she might be stuck in Modesto for days. Overriding her instincts and ignoring the pleas of her companions, Mary grabbed her bag and told them that she was going to take the risk. She said goodbye, ran back to the waiting light blue van, opened the passenger door, and climbed inside. As soon as Mary sat down and pulled the door shut, the man immediately shifted the van into gear, pulled out onto the highway, and merged into the flow of traffic. Once they were cruising down the road, the driver turned to Mary with a polite smile and introduced himself. He said his name was Lawrence Singleton, and he confirmed that he was 50 years old. Mary introduced herself in return, and the two began to engage in casual, polite small talk. Lawrence was highly skilled at projecting an aura of safety and warmth. As they drove, his calm demeanor and gentle tone of voice completely put Mary at ease. Within a short period, her initial anxiety began to melt away entirely. To Mary, Lawrence did not look like a predator. He reminded her of her own grandfather, a kind, harmless older man who was simply doing a favor for a stranded teenager. Because she had been running on pure adrenaline and very little sleep for the past few days, the comforting environment of the moving van made Mary incredibly drowsy. She turned to Lawrence and asked if he would mind if she closed her eyes and took a quick nap while he drove. Lawrence smiled warmly and told her it was no problem at all, encouraging her to get some rest. Relieved, Mary curled up in the passenger seat, turned her body away from him, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she fell into a deep, trusting sleep. A significant amount of time passed before Mary finally woke up. As her eyes adjusted and she looked out the passenger window, she noticed the positioning of the sun and the landmarks along the road. Her heart sank as she realized that the geography was entirely wrong. They were not traveling south towards Southern California and Nevada, they were heading in the exact opposite direction. Mary immediately turned to Lawrence and pointed out the error, telling him that they were going the wrong way. Lawrence acted surprised, hitting the steering wheel lightly and claiming that he had simply made a foolish navigational mistake. He apologized profusely, assuring her that he would find the next available exit, turn the van around, and get them back on the correct path. Mary nodded, trying to accept his excuse, but deep down, a profound sense of dread began to take root. They had traveled miles in the wrong direction. It felt statistically impossible for an experienced adult driver to make such a massive, prolonged error by accident. True to his word, however, Lawrence exited the highway, turned the light blue van around, and began driving south. This action temporarily confused Mary's instinct. If he was a dangerous kidnapper, why would he willingly turn the car back around toward her desired destination? Despite this, Mary remained completely on edge. Her senses were highly heightened, but she was careful to keep her face neutral and her voice calm. She knew she was trapped in a moving vehicle with an older, stronger adult, and she did not want to trigger an aggressive reaction by showing her intense fear or accusing him of lying. She sat silently in the passenger seat, watching the passing landscape with growing apprehension. Eventually, the van left the main interstate and entered a long, isolated stretch of secondary highway that wound through a heavily forested, densely wooded area. The surrounding trees grew thick and tall, blocking out much of the natural sunlight, and the traffic on this particular road completely thinned out until Lawrence's van was the only vehicle in sight. Suddenly, Lawrence broke the silence. He turned to Mary and announced that he needed to pull the van over immediately because he had to use the bathroom. Mary felt her stomach drop. The isolation of the forest was terrifying, but she tried to maintain her composure. She gave a tight, apprehensive nod and muttered that it was fine. As Lawrence began to slow the van down and steer it toward the edge of the road, Mary instinctively looked down at her own feet. She noticed that one of her sneakers had come completely untied. A sudden, sharp realization flashed through her mind. If this man tried to attack her, she would need to run as fast as possible, and a loose shoe would cause her to trip and fall. She knew she needed to tie the shoe immediately, but she was too terrified to bend down and do it while they were still in the front seats. The space was incredibly cramped, and she worried that making a sudden movement to tie her shoe would look highly suspicious to Lawrence, potentially causing him to launch an attack right there. She quickly decided that the moment the van came to a complete stop, she would open her door, step outside under the guise of stretching her legs, and immediately tie her laces on the solid ground. However, Lawrence did not simply pull over onto the dirt shoulder of the main road. Instead, he steered the light blue van onto a rugged, unpaved access road that cut deeply into the dense forest. As the van bumped along the dirt track, moving further and further away from the safety of the highway, absolute alarm bells began to scream inside Mary's head. She knew with absolute certainty that she was in profound danger. There was no innocent reason for a driver to navigate deep into an isolated forest just to relieve himself. Panic paralyzed her. She stared straight ahead, unable to look at Lawrence, her mind racing through every possible scenario. Should she try to jump out of the moving van? Should she scream? Should she confront him? Before she could form a coherent plan, Lawrence drove the van deep enough into the woods that they were completely invisible to anyone on the main highway. He brought the vehicle to a final stop, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the quiet forest. The moment Lawrence opened his door and stepped outside, Mary immediately opened the passenger door and scrambled out onto the dirt ground, desperate for fresh air and room to move. Keeping her head down, she immediately bent over and began reaching for her loose shoelaces, focused entirely on securing her footwear so she could prepare to run. But she never got the chance to finish. Before her fingers could tie the knot, a massive, crushing force struck her violently in the back of the head. The impact was so severe that it instantly short-circuited her nervous system, knocking her completely unconscious. Lawrence had not stepped out of the van to use the restroom. Before exiting, he had quietly reached down and grabbed a heavy hammer that he kept concealed right next to the driver's seat. He had silently walked around the front of the vehicle, crept up behind the unsuspecting 15-year-old girl, and smashed the heavy tool into her skull. When Mary finally regained consciousness, she found herself in total darkness. She was lying flat on her back on the hard metal floor in the rear cargo area of the light blue van. Her head was throbbing with excruciating, blinding pain, and she felt incredibly disoriented. As her vision slowly cleared, she looked out the rear windows of the van and realized that the vehicle was still parked in the exact same isolated spot deep within the forest. She instinctively tried to sit up and move her arms, but she immediately realized she was completely trapped. Lawrence had used heavy ropes and restraints to tie her hands and her feet securely to the interior structural frame of the van. She was pinned down, entirely immobile and completely at his mercy. Before she could fully process the horror of her restraint, she heard footsteps approaching the vehicle. Lawrence walked to the back of the van, swung the heavy rear doors wide open, and climbed into the cargo area. The polite, grandfatherly facade he had maintained on the highway was entirely gone. His face was cold, detached, and monstrous. Without saying a single word, he immediately launched a brutal, vicious, and prolonged physical and sexual assault against the bound teenager. Mary was absolutely terrified, a young child trapped in a living nightmare with a sadistic adult. She did not have the physical strength to fight back against her restraints, so she resorted to the only weapon she had left, her voice. As Lawrence assaulted her, Mary began to quietly, desperately beg for her life. Over and over again, through heavy tears, she whimpered, pleading with him to stop, promising him that if he just let her go, she would never tell a single soul what he had done to her. She promised to keep his secret forever if he would just show her a shred of mercy. Lawrence never responded to her pleas. He never spoke, he never yelled, and he never looked at her with remorse. He simply continued his horrific assault in absolute chilling silence for hours on end, ignoring her cries as the afternoon transitioned into the dark of night. Eventually, Lawrence grew physically exhausted. He finally stopped the assault, climbed out of the rear cargo area, and walked around to the front of the van. He climbed into the driver's seat, leaned his head back, and fell into a deep sleep. Back in the dark cargo hold, Mary lay in absolute agony. She spent the long night hours frantically pulling and twisting against the ropes, desperate to find some slack that would allow her to free her hands or feet. But Lawrence had tied the knots with expert, unyielding precision. The tight ropes only cut deeper into her skin, leaving her entirely unable to escape. She was left alone with her thoughts in the pitch black, weeping silently, wondering if she would ever see her family again, and fearing what this monster would do to her when he woke up. In the middle of the night, Lawrence suddenly awoke. Without uttering a word to the terrified girl in the back, he started the van's engine, shifted into gear, and drove out of the forest access road. He navigated back onto the main highway and drove through the darkness for a significant distance. Mary lay in the back, shifting violently with the movement of the van, completely unaware of where they were going. Eventually, Lawrence turned off the highway onto another remote access road, driving deep into an entirely different wilderness area. This time, he navigated the van down into the deep, rocky isolation of a massive desert canyon, far away from any potential witnesses or prying eyes. He brought the van to a final stop, walked around to the back, and opened the doors once again. Mary, battered and weeping, began her desperate begging all over again, crying out for freedom. But Lawrence remained entirely deaf to her suffering. He climbed back into the van, and the horrific torture and assault resumed, continuing unabated through the final hours of the night until the dark sky finally began to break and the morning sun rose over the canyon walls. When the sunlight finally illuminated the interior of the van, Lawrence stopped. He climbed out of the vehicle and stood on the dirt ground, staring in at his victim. He reached forward and, to Mary's immense shock, began to untie the heavy restraints that bound her limbs. He pulled her battered, bloodied body out of the cargo hold and forced her to stand upright on her feet. Mary was entirely weak, her body covered in deep bruises and blood, her spirit nearly broken. Believing that this might be the moment of her release, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered a final plea, asking him to please just let her go home. Lawrence looked at her with a cruel, mocking expression. He repeated her words back to her, stating that since she wanted to be set free so badly, he was going to set her free. He walked away from her toward the front of the van, reached into a heavy metal toolbox, and pulled out a sharp, heavy-duty hatchet. Mary had only a fraction of a second to realize what was happening before Lawrence closed the distance between them. In one fluid, terrifying motion, he used his left hand to firmly grab Mary's left wrist, anchoring her arm in place. With his right hand, he raised the heavy hatchet high into the air and brought it down with massive force onto her left forearm. The sharp blade sliced cleanly through her flesh, muscle, and bone, completely severing her left arm off her body just below the elbow joint. The sheer shock and physical trauma caused Mary to fall backward onto the hard dirt ground. She stared down in absolute horror at the gaping, spurting wound where her left arm had been just moments before. Her brain struggled to process the unimaginable agony. But before she could even scream, Lawrence stepped over her. He reached down with his left hand, grabbed her right wrist, and pinned it down. Mary knew with absolute certainty what was coming next. Terrified and fighting for her life, she began to scream at the top of her lungs, kicking her legs out violently, striking Lawrence's body with all the remaining strength she possessed in a desperate bid to force him off her. But Lawrence's grip on her right wrist was unyielding. He raised the hatchet again and began hacking at her right forearm. It took 4 separate, brutal, agonizing blows of the hatchet to finally cut through the bone and completely sever her right arm from her body. Mary collapsed into a crumpled heap on the ground, bleeding profusely from both of her severed limbs, her body experiencing a level of physical pain that few human beings have ever survived. As she lay there screaming, Lawrence did not look at her face. Instead, his attention was completely caught by something bizarre and horrific. When he had severed Mary's left arm, her hand had instinctively clutched onto the sleeve of his shirt in a final death grip. Now, her severed left hand was still firmly attached to his clothing. With an air of absolute indifference and nonchalance, Lawrence stood over her, completely ignoring her screams, and began casually flicking his arm, trying to shake the severed hand off his sleeve. After a few moments, the hand finally detached and fell to the earth. Lawrence turned his attention back to Mary and noticed that she had suddenly gone entirely silent. Her body had gone completely limp, and she was lying motionless in a massive, expanding pool of her own blood. Believing that she had finally succumbed to blood loss and shock, Lawrence calmly walked back to his van, placed the bloody hatchet inside his toolbox, and walked back over to her seemingly lifeless body. He grabbed Mary by her shoulders and began dragging her body across the dirt ground, leaving a thick trail of blood in his wake. About 100 feet down the remote canyon road, the path ran directly over a massive concrete culvert, a giant drainage tunnel built deep underneath the roadway to allow water and heavy storm runoff to pass safely beneath the concrete without washing the road away. This particular culvert was constructed roughly 30 feet below the actual surface of the road. If a person stood on the edge of the road, there was a steep, near vertical 30-foot drop-off down onto a bed of jagged rocks and boulders that surrounded the opening of the drainage tunnel. Lawrence dragged Mary's limp body directly to the edge of this precipice. Without a single hint of hesitation, he threw her body over the side, sending her plunging 30 feet down through the air to smash violently against the jagged rocks below. Lawrence then carefully navigated his way down the steep dirt embankment to the bottom of the canyon. He walked over to her crumpled body, picked her up, and stuffed her deep inside the dark, cold concrete interior of the culvert drainage pipe, hiding her from view. As he turned his back to walk away and leave her to die alone in the wilderness, he looked into the tunnel and uttered a final, chilling sentence. "Now you're free." But miracles do happen, and Mary Vincent was not dead. Legally, medically, and physically, she should have died at multiple different points during this horrific sequence of events. She should have died from the initial hammer blow, the massive blood loss from 2 severed limbs, the shock of the amputations, or the severe internal trauma of being thrown down a 30-foot cliff onto solid rock. But against all mathematical and medical odds, her heart kept beating. Later in her life, Mary would recount the terrifying reality that she was completely lucid, fully conscious, and profoundly aware of everything that happened to her during the entire attack, except for the brief moment she was knocked out by the hammer. She vividly remembered the sensation of her arms being severed. She recalled that when Lawrence first grabbed her left wrist, she had instinctively clamped her fingers down onto his shirt sleeve, trying to anchor herself. When the hatchet came down and severed her arm, she remembered falling backward, but her brain experienced a strange phenomenon where time seemed to slow down to an absolute crawl. As she fell through the air, she looked up and literally saw her own severed hand still firmly gripping the sleeve of Lawrence's shirt, detached from her body. When Lawrence began hacking at her right arm, Mary realized that if she continued to scream, kick, and fight, he would realize she was still alive and would likely use the hatchet to cut her throat or smash her skull. In a moment of supreme instinctual genius, she forced her entire body to go completely limp. She kept her eyes half open, maintaining a blank, glazed stare, and completely stopped breathing out loud. She watched through her eyelashes as Lawrence casually flicked her severed hand off his arm. She remained absolutely still and silent as he dragged her across the dirt, and she did not make a single sound or whimper when he threw her body off the 30-foot drop-off. The fall broke 4 of her ribs and caused immense internal agony, but her fierce will to survive told her that she had to endure the punishment in absolute silence, or he would finish her off. She lay perfectly still inside the dark concrete culvert, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away, followed by the distant sound of his van engine starting up and driving off into the distance. Even after the van left, Mary did not immediately move. She worried that Lawrence might have parked his van further up the road and could be waiting at the top of the cliff, watching to see if she would crawl out. She forced herself to lie in a contorted, agonizing position inside the cold pipe for a long time. Eventually, the extreme blood loss began to take its toll, and an overwhelming, heavy wave of fatigue washed over her. She felt herself slipping toward unconsciousness, but she suddenly heard a distinct, powerful voice echoing inside her own mind. The voice told her with absolute clarity, "You cannot go to sleep. If you go to sleep right now, you are going to die. And if you die, this monster will get away with what he did, and he will do this to someone else." This thought triggered a massive, life-saving surge of adrenaline through her system. Mary made a definitive decision. She was going to live, and she was going to bring her attacker to justice. She slowly dragged her broken body out of the dark culvert. Once she was out on the canyon floor, she looked at the raw, bleeding nubs of her forearms. Knowing that she was rapidly bleeding to death, She dug the exposed bones and flesh of her arms directly into the dirt and mud, manually packing the open wounds with soil to create a crude, natural tourniquet to stop the bleeding. Then she realized that if she walked with her arms down, the gravity would cause her remaining blood and muscle tissue to slip out of the wounds. She raised her mutilated forearms high above her head and began the impossible task of climbing up the steep 30-foot embankment. Using her feet, her knees, and her broken ribs, she crawled and scratched her way up the dirt cliff until she finally reached the edge of the road. She was completely naked, covered from head to toe in thick mud, dirt, and her own blood, looking like a figure from a horror movie. She began to run down the highway, desperate for help. A car soon approached, but the driver was so utterly terrified by the sight of a blood-soaked, armless figure running down the road in the middle of nowhere that they panicked, stepped on the gas, and drove right past her. Refusing to give up, Mary kept running. She ran for 3 agonizing miles down the hot highway under the morning sun until she finally managed to flag down another vehicle. This car was occupied by a young couple. Though they were initially struck with absolute horror and shock by Mary's appearance, they quickly realized she was a victim in desperate need of help. They lifted her into their vehicle and sped down the highway toward the nearest hospital. Mary Vincent spent the next full month in the hospital undergoing intensive surgeries to save her life, treat her broken ribs, and clean her infected arm wounds. Throughout her grueling physical recovery, her mind remained sharp. She met with police detectives and provided them with an incredibly precise, highly detailed description of Lawrence Singleton, his physical features, his age, and the exact appearance of his light blue passenger van. Using her stellar memory, forensic artists created a highly accurate composite sketch of the attacker, which was immediately broadcast across television news and printed in local newspapers. Not long after the sketch was released, one of Lawrence Singleton's neighbors recognized the drawing and the description of the van. The neighbor contacted the police, leading to Singleton's immediate arrest. He was brought to trial, where Mary Vincent bravely took the witness stand, looked her attacker in the eye, and testified in detail about the horrors he had inflicted upon her. Singleton was found guilty of multiple counts, including kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. However, due to the specific laws of California in 1978, the maximum sentence the judge could legally hand down for these crimes was a mere 14 years in prison. The judge expressed immense frustration, stating on the record that he wished he could lock Singleton away for life, but his hands were legally tied by the statute. As Mary was leaving the courthouse following the sentencing, she had to walk directly past Singleton. He leaned in close to the young girl, lowered his voice, and whispered a terrifying promise. "I will finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life." Because of automatic prison credits for good behavior and his work as a teacher's assistant behind bars, Lawrence Singleton was paroled in 1986, having served just 8 years of his 14-year sentence. His release sparked massive public outrage and protests across California. Mary, who had since grown up, gotten married, and given birth to 2 sons, was absolutely paralyzed with fear. She spent years looking over her shoulder, terrified that her stalker would fulfill his vow to finish the job and murder her and her children. But Singleton did not go after Mary. Instead, he relocated to Florida, where his violent, predatory nature inevitably resurfaced. In 1997, nearly 20 years after his attack on Mary, Singleton brutally attacked and murdered a 31-year-old mother of 3 named Roxanne Hayes in his home. He stabbed her multiple times, ending her life. At his murder trial in Florida, Mary Vincent bravely traveled to the courtroom to testify against him once again, providing the jury with first-hand evidence of his history of extreme sadistic violence. Her powerful testimony was instrumental in helping the prosecution secure a definitive death sentence for Singleton. However, before the state of Florida could execute him, Lawrence Singleton died of cancer in a prison hospital room in the year 2001. When Mary received the news of his death, she admitted to feeling deeply cheated that he had died of natural causes rather than facing the executioner. However, her sons expressed immense relief that the monster who had haunted their mother's life was finally gone forever, and Mary took great solace in knowing he could never hurt another soul. The widespread public fury over Singleton's early release in California, combined with the tragic preventable death of Roxanne Hayes, led directly to a major overhaul of the American legal system. Lawmakers drafted and passed a landmark piece of legislation known as the Lawrence Singleton Bill. This law fundamentally changed sentencing guidelines for violent crimes, giving judges the explicit legal authority to hand down sentences of 25 years to life for any criminal acts that involved explicit torture, aggravated mayhem, or the intentional mutilation of a victim's body. Under the rules of this bill, if Lawrence Singleton had committed his horrific crimes against Mary Vincent today, he would never have been granted parole, he would never have walked free, and Roxanne Hayes would still be alive. Mary Vincent refused to let her trauma define the rest of her existence. She went on to become a highly accomplished artist and an outspoken advocate for victims of violent crime. Using custom-designed prosthetic arms that she learned to master with incredible dexterity, she reclaimed her life, her independence, and her joy, standing as a permanent symbol of the unbreakable power of the human spirit. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. It was a little after 1 in the afternoon on the 18th of May, 2007, when a 57-year-old woman named Yvonne de Hoorde arrived at a large park in the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. She was on her way to meet a friend, and his house was located right in the middle of this park, so she had to walk through it to get there. This was a daily ritual for Yvonne. Nearly every single day, she would make this same walk to go and spend time with her friend. Usually, on a weekday afternoon, the park was pretty quiet. There might be a few people strolling along the paths, but for the most part, it was a calm and peaceful walk. But on this particular day, the park was absolutely packed with people. It was the Friday, kicking off a long holiday weekend, and the weather was beautiful and sunny. It seemed like everyone in the city had the same idea to come out and enjoy the spring air. Families were everywhere, the playground was overflowing with kids, and the park's little cafe had a line out the door. Yvonne, however, wasn't really paying much attention to the crowds around her. Her mind was focused entirely on her friend. They had known each other for years, and in her heart, she felt they shared a very special connection, the kind of bond she didn't really have with anyone else in her life. Now, Yvonne was well aware that many people, including some of her own family and friends, didn't quite see it that way. They thought the relationship was less special and more strange. Some had even told her directly that they disapproved of it, and she could understand why they might feel that way, at least on the surface. Yvonne was a very friendly, social, and outgoing person. She loved to chat and be around people. Her friend, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He was extremely reclusive and almost never left his house. To an outsider, they seemed like a very odd pair. There were other things, too. Her friend was originally from Germany, and even though he had been living in the Netherlands for many years, he had never learned to speak Dutch. This meant he couldn't really communicate with anyone, and that included Yvonne, at least not with words. But for Yvonne, none of that mattered. In fact, the disapproval from others only made her feel more protective of him. She felt like people just didn't understand. She was also deeply sympathetic to his past. She knew that her friend had been abandoned by his mother when he was just a child, and this fact always tugged at her heart. In a way, she saw herself as a sort of maternal figure in his life, stepping in to offer the care and companionship he had been denied. And so, as she continued her walk, her thoughts filled with warmth for her friend, she rounded a final corner on the path. Up ahead, she could see his house. As she got closer, she could see him through one of the front windows. He didn't look happy at all. He looked downcast, almost dejected, and seeing him like that made her want to cheer him up even more. So she put on her biggest, warmest smile. She started waving enthusiastically as she approached his house, trying to catch his eye. And sure enough, after a moment, he turned his head, looked out the window, and saw her. His entire demeanor changed. He broke into a big smile and began to wave back at her. For Yvonne, this was everything. It was proof of their connection. Even without a shared language, they understood each other. Seeing his smile filled her with a pure sense of happiness. She felt so glad that she was there for him. She walked the rest of the way to his house and went to see him. That day was spent much like all their other days together. Because they couldn't talk, their time was filled with simple gestures and quiet companionship. They would just sit together, enjoying each other's presence. It was a unique relationship, but for Yvonne, it was more than enough. She truly believed he felt the same way, that he valued their time together just as much as she did. But as much as she cherished these visits, she couldn't stay all day. She had her own family and responsibilities to get back to. So, at around 2:30 inches the afternoon, after spending about an hour with him, she said her goodbyes. She turned to leave, knowing that she would be back again soon, probably the very next day. Yvonne walked away from her friend's house and had only taken a few steps down the path when two different things happened at almost the exact same time. First, she noticed a group of young kids off to the side, and they were throwing rocks. It was just a small detail, but her mind registered it. It was the kind of thing that you see and instinctively know shouldn't be happening in a public park. She didn't think much more of it, but she was aware of it. The second thing she noticed was a sound. It was the sound of splashing coming from somewhere behind her. This seemed odd. It hadn't rained recently, so there were no puddles on the path. The only source of water nearby was a small stream that ran through the park, but it was in an area that was off-limits to visitors. There was no reason anyone should be in there. But the splashing sound was unmistakable. Yvonne wasn't alarmed by any of this, just curious. Her mind was simply processing these little details from her surroundings. And so, she found herself turning around, mostly to see what could possibly be making that splashing noise. As she turned, something enormous and powerful slammed into her. It hit her with such force that she was knocked to the ground and pinned there. All around her, the park erupted in screams. The last conscious thought that flashed through her mind before she blacked out was, "Oh my God, I'm about to die." Not too far away, a man named Arved Hendris was also at the park with his wife and their two young children. They were standing right outside that little cafe that Yvonne had been walking near. Arved had just been about to go inside to buy some drinks when the commotion started. He heard the same screams that had filled Yvonne's final moments of consciousness. The cafe was a small place, really more of a glorified snack bar than a restaurant. It sat on a main pathway that cut through the park and had a large pavilion out front with tables and chairs. From where Arved was standing on that pavilion, he could hear the screaming getting louder, and then he saw people. Dozens of people were running directly towards him. But Arved had absolutely no idea what was happening. He couldn't see what they were screaming about or what they were running from. It was just pure sudden panic. Instinct took over. Before he even knew what the threat was, his first thought was to protect his family. He grabbed his kids and his wife and ran into the cafe along with the rest of the terrified crowd. The inside of the cafe felt a bit like a small dining hall, with large communal tables filling the space. It wasn't built to hold this many people at once. As everyone rushed inside, the room quickly descended into chaos. A few people had the presence of mind to try and barricade the entrance. The front door brothers were made of glass and wouldn't offer much protection, but they did their best, shoving tables and chairs against them to block whatever was outside. After this initial rush, a strange and tense calm fell over the room. The air was still buzzing with fear, but the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. Arved, like most of the other people crammed inside, was still completely in the dark. They had all just reacted to the panic of the crowd, assuming there must have been a very real danger outside. Now, in this weird lull, everyone was looking around at each other, wondering what was going on. Were they safe now? Or had they overreacted? As they all stood there in suspense, the glass of the front doors suddenly shattered. The sound sent a fresh wave of terror through the cafe. The room was plunged back into absolute chaos. Parents were grabbing their children, screaming, and now everyone was trying to get out. The place that had seemed like a safe shelter moments before now felt like a trap. A huge bottleneck formed at the shattered doors as dozens of people tried to squeeze through at once. It was just a frantic crush of bodies. Arved looked at the mob of people and knew there was no way he could get his family through that safely. So he made a different choice. He grabbed his wife and his kids, and he pulled them under one of the large, heavy tables to hide. For the next couple of minutes, the sounds of madness continued all around them. People were screaming, crying, and scrambling to get out of the cafe. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it all went quiet. Everyone else had made it out. It was just Arved and his family huddled together under the table, listening to the silence. For a brief moment, Arved felt a sense of relief. He thought, whatever it was, it's over. We're safe. But just before he told his family it was okay to come out, he heard another sound. It was the sound of more glass breaking. And then he heard loud, heavy, stomping sounds. Something huge was making its way through the broken front doors and into the cafe. Arved peered out from under the table, and in that moment, when he saw what had entered the cafe, he finally understood why everyone had been running. He also realized that he and his family were now trapped. It would turn out that all the people in Yvonne's life who had frowned upon her special friendship had been right to be concerned. Because although Yvonne loved her friend and their daily routine, her friend did not feel the same way at all. Every day, when Yvonne would visit, she would sit with her friend and keep him company, and she would smile at him. And in her mind, when her friend smiled back, it was a sign of their mutual affection. It was the foundation of their bond. What Yvonne never knew was that her friend absolutely hated it. For him, her smile was not a friendly gesture. On that particular Friday afternoon, her friend was already in a very bad mood. The park surrounding his home was far more crowded and noisy than usual. And those kids that Yvonne had briefly noticed, the ones throwing rocks, they had been doing it for a while. Some of those rocks had been hitting his house, and the repeated thuds were making him more and more agitated. And then, through all of this, Yvonne had been there, smiling at him over and over again. She thought she was being comforting, but her actions were just adding fuel to the fire. Her constant smiling sent him right over the edge. So, when Yvonne finally got up and walked away, you might think her friend would have felt a sense of relief. One of the sources of his agitation was finally gone. But he knew she wasn't leaving for good. She would just come back tomorrow and the day after that, like she always did, with that same infuriating smile. He just couldn't take it anymore. So, he snapped. He stormed out of his house, splashing through that off-limit stream to get across the park to where Yvonne was walking away. And just before he reached her, she turned around and saw him. This time, he smiled at her before she could smile at him. And for the very first time, she didn't smile back. Instead, her face was filled with terror. And that was because Yvonne's friend was a 400-pound silverback gorilla named Bocato. And the park he lived in was a zoo. To silverback gorillas, baring your teeth in what humans call a smile is not a sign of friendship. It is a sign of aggression, a threat, a display of hostility. So, from Bocato's point of view, it's very likely that for years, almost every single day, Yvonne had been coming to his enclosure to threaten him. And when he smiled back, showing his own teeth, he was threatening her right back, hoping she would finally get the message and leave him alone. But it never worked. She always came back. Eventually, it all just became too much for him to handle. Luckily, despite the rampage, Bocato didn't seriously harm anyone else. He bit Yvonne over 100 times and broke multiple of her bones, but somehow she did survive the attack. No other zoo guests were injured, including Arvevd and his family. They were trapped in that cafe while Bokedo walked around inside, but for whatever reason, the gorilla never attacked them. After some time, Arved and his family were able to make a run for it and get to safety. After she had recovered from her injuries, Yvonne spoke to the media. She told them that Bokedo was still her darling. That's the word she used. And incredibly, she would eventually go back to the zoo to see him again. But this time, she didn't smile. At 3 o'clock in the morning, on the 11th of August, 1965, a 19-year-old student named Ally Dogan was sitting in the very front seat of a passenger bus as it traveled down a dark, narrow road in northwest Turkey. Ally and the 50 or so other passengers were making the journey from the city of Ankara to Istanbul, the largest city in the country. They were about 3 hours into what was supposed to be a 5-hour trip. To pass the time, Ally had been talking quietly with the man sitting next to him. The man was a lieutenant in the Air Force. The lieutenant told Ally that he wasn't even supposed to be on this bus. Originally, he had a plane ticket to fly to Istanbul, but he had missed his flight. And so, here he was. But the lieutenant wasn't upset about it. He told Ally that he was actually really enjoying the bus ride. He had never been on a long-distance bus trip before, and he thought it was a neat experience. Most importantly, he had managed to get a seat in the very front row, right behind the huge front window of the bus. He said he found it exhilarating to be able to see the road rushing towards them in the dark. Ally felt the exact same way. In fact, when he had first boarded the bus, someone else had been sitting in his seat next to the lieutenant. Ally had specifically asked that passenger if they would be willing to switch spots with him because he wanted that incredible view too. So he and the lieutenant had quickly bonded over their shared excitement for their front row seats. They spoke in hushed voices because nearly everyone else on the bus was fast asleep around them. But these two were wide awake, wired with the simple thrill of watching the road unfold before them. But after a while, despite his enthusiasm, Ali started to feel drowsy. He was on his way back to Istanbul for college, and later that day, he had a very important exam. As much as he wanted to stay up all night and enjoy the ride, he knew he really needed to get some sleep if he was going to do well on his test. So he took off his sweatshirt, rolled it up into a makeshift pillow, and placed it behind his head. He told the lieutenant he was going to try and get some rest, then he leaned his head back and closed his eyes. About 15 minutes passed, and Ally was just beginning to drift into a real sleep, when the bus was suddenly filled with the sound of screams. Ally's eyes snapped open. He looked straight ahead out the front windshield and saw a pair of bright headlights barreling down on them. They were in the wrong lane, or another vehicle was in their lane. It didn't matter. He knew in that instant that they were about to have a head-on collision. Then, the bus driver wrenched the wheel, and the bus swerved hard to the right. Ally grabbed onto the partition in front of him to keep from being thrown out of his seat. He braced himself for the impact he knew was coming. But at the very last second, instead of smashing into the other vehicle, the bus veered completely off the road. It went crashing down into a deep ditch that ran alongside the road. The bus lurched violently before the driver managed to slam on the brakes and bring it to a stop. For a second, there was silence. Ally looked around. Everyone was shaken up, but it seemed they were okay. He felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. They had avoided what would have been a catastrophic crash. But that feeling of relief didn't last long. Ally quickly realized they had a new and very serious problem. The bus was starting to fill with thick smoke. Because they were sitting at the very front, Ally and the lieutenant were the closest to the main door. It was clear that they needed to evacuate immediately. It looked like the crash had started some kind of fire. The two men stood up. The bus was tilted at a strange angle from where it had landed in the ditch. They made their way to the front and looked out through the now cracked front windshield. Out in the darkness, they could see a huge truck that was also in the ditch just ahead of them. That must have been the vehicle they had nearly hit. It seemed they had collided with it after all, just not head-on. It was a dangerous situation. There was clearly a fire somewhere, and they had to get everyone off the bus as fast as possible. Ally and the lieutenant got to the door and tried to open it, but the frame of the bus had been warped in the crash, and the door was jammed shut. The lieutenant got down and started smashing his body against the door, trying to force it open. As he did this, the smoke inside the bus was getting thicker and darker. The other passengers were starting to panic. They were all rushing towards the front, crowding around Ally and the lieutenant, desperate to get out. Finally, with a loud groan of metal, the lieutenant managed to force the door open. The second it opened, an even bigger plume of black smoke poured into the bus from outside. You could barely see a thing. Everyone was choking and screaming. The lieutenant just yelled at Ally to get out right now. And so Ally was the first person off the bus. He scrambled down the steps into a wall of smoke. He had no idea where the fire was actually coming from. It was just smoke everywhere. Acting on pure instinct, he just jumped. He leaped as high and as far away from the bus as he possibly could. He landed on the far side of the ditch. He stumbled but managed to climb up the other side of the embankment, putting distance between himself and the bus. As soon as he was clear, he turned around and looked back. It was the middle of the night, but even in the darkness, he could see the bus was completely swallowed by that thick, dark smoke. He still couldn't see any flames, but he figured the engine must have caught fire and it was spreading underneath the bus. He could hear the people still on board, desperately trying to get out through the single door that the lieutenant had opened. But there seemed to be a bottleneck. They weren't getting out fast enough. People were screaming in panic, and then Ally heard the sound of windows being pushed open. People were so desperate that they were starting to jump out of the windows to escape. At first, the screams Ally heard sounded like fear, the desperate cries of people trying to evacuate a burning vehicle. But very quickly, as more people started coming out of the bus, the sound of their screams changed. They turned into screams of pure, unimaginable agony. As Ally listened to this horror unfold, he tried to make sense of it. He thought, okay, maybe they're catching on fire as they jump out. Or maybe they're breaking bones when they land in the ditch. It was all terrible, but at least they were getting out of the bus. He was sure that any second they would climb up the other side of the ditch and join him where he stood. He saw them coming out. He heard them, but no one came. The screams of agony just got louder and louder, and nobody climbed out of that ditch. Ally was still all alone, and he had no idea why. All he could see was smoke, and all he could hear were those terrible screams. Then, authorities began to arrive at the scene. He watched as they rushed into the smoke, trying to fight whatever fire was there and rescue the people trapped inside. But despite this huge emergency response happening right in front of him, nobody, not even the lieutenant who had saved him, ever came over the ditch to where he was. He was completely alone. After some time, Ally noticed a few of the emergency workers walking away from the bus, away from the smoke. They were carrying what looked like bodies. But as he stared, a cold dread filled him. They weren't carrying whole bodies. They were carrying body parts. It would turn out that many of the initial assumptions were correct. The bus had swerved to avoid an oncoming vehicle. It had struck the big truck that Ally and the lieutenant saw in the ditch. It wasn't a head-on impact, but more of a glancing blow. That collision was enough to send both vehicles off the road and into the ditch. And the crash is what caused all the smoke. But everyone, including Ally, had been completely wrong about what was causing that smoke. There was no fire at all. The truck that the bus had hit was a shipping truck. It was transporting a huge cargo of freight to Istanbul. When the two vehicles collided, the truck's shipping containers were ruptured and the entire contents of those containers poured out into the ditch. The ditch, where the bus had crashed, already had a significant amount of standing water in it from recent rains. When the freight from the truck mixed with the water, it triggered a powerful chemical reaction. And that chemical reaction is what produced the thick, choking clouds of smoke. The freight being transported in that truck was nitric acid. It's a highly corrosive and extremely toxic liquid chemical. Now, that entire ditch, which was filled with water, had become a massive smoking acid bath. And so all of those desperate passengers, thinking they were escaping a fire, were leaping out of the bus and landing directly in the ditch. They were landing in a pool of diluted but still incredibly powerful acid, and they were being dissolved by it. Ally had survived for one simple reason. When he was the first one to get off the bus, he thought he was jumping away from a fire at the base of the vehicle. So he took a huge leap, trying to clear the flames he imagined were there. In doing so, without realizing it, he had jumped completely over the acid bath and landed safely on the other side. But virtually everyone who came after him went straight into the acid. In the end, of the nearly 50 people who had been on that bus, 26 of them dissolved to death in that ditch. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the night of the 25th of August 2011, a 23-year-old woman named Risa Dura and her husband Hioki Dura were sitting together on their couch. They were in their apartment in Kanazawa City, Japan, and they were just watching some TV. And as they sat there, they were both laughing hysterically at what was on the screen. It was their absolute favorite show, a hidden camera comedy prank show. For them, this was the perfect way to end the day, just sitting here together on the couch, laughing their heads off. Risa and Hioki had only been married for 4 months. They were still deep in that newlywed bliss period where they spent basically every possible second they could with each other. When Hioki wasn't at work, the two of them were always out and about. They'd go out to eat at their favorite restaurants, they'd go to the movies, or they'd take little day trips to the beach, since Kanazawa City was right there on the coast. And whenever they were out, they were constantly talking about how lucky they felt. They truly believed they had found their perfect match in each other. They were married, and this was what the rest of their lives was going to look like. Just being together, happy. They felt like the luckiest people in the world. Risa and Hioki had actually known each other for a long time. They first met when they were just kids in middle school. But back then, Hioki was extremely shy. He was so quiet that he really didn't speak to Risa at all. He had a crush on her, but he never let it show. So, nothing ever came of it. But then, years later, after they had both finished college and were starting their adult lives, they just happened to run into each other again. And this time, Hioki, who was still a bit shy but had grown more confident, decided he had to tell Risa the truth. He confessed to her that he had always loved her all the way back in middle school, and that he still did. Risa was totally shocked by this. She had always kind of felt something for him too, but because he was so quiet, it just never seemed like he was interested in her at all. So to her, this was this incredible revelation, but it was more than just a surprise. It was incredibly romantic. It felt like something out of a classic Hollywood love story. This quiet boy she knew from her childhood had been harboring this secret love for her all these years. And so, when he finally confessed his feelings, she pretty much immediately said yes to a date. She was so excited, and from that very first date, it was just a total whirlwind. They fell completely and totally in love, and within a year, they were married. They ended up settling in Kanazawa City mostly because of Hioki's job. He worked for a company that was based in the city, and he was doing really well there. He was considered a rising star. Every time Risa would meet one of his coworkers, they would rave about him. They'd say what a hard worker he was, what a natural-born leader he was becoming. Risa was so proud of him. But more than that, she felt inspired by his drive and his passion for his work. It made her want to find a really fulfilling job for herself, something she could be just as passionate about. So, she was actively on the hunt for her own career. But for the moment, Risa was still in that phase of trying to figure out exactly what she wanted to do. She had so many interests and was always jumping from one thing to another. She had this huge, insatiable curiosity about the world, and she absolutely loved trying new things. This was a wonderful quality, but it also made it really hard for her to choose just one single path for her life. But Hioki was incredibly supportive through all of it. He treated Risa like she was royalty. He always told her that whatever she wanted to do was completely fine by him as long as it made her happy. He just wanted to see her smile. So for now, as Risa sat on the couch next to Hioki, laughing at this funny show, her mind started to wander. It drifted away from the television and away from her ongoing job search and landed on Hioki's birthday. It was coming up very soon, and she felt this immense pressure to do something really, really special for him. A big part of that pressure came from the fact that Hioki always did something incredibly thoughtful and amazing for her. For her birthday, for any special occasion, he really knew how to celebrate her and make her feel loved. She didn't want to underwhelm him with her gift. Plus, this was going to be the first time either of them had a birthday now that they were officially married. So Risa wanted to go all out. She wanted to plan something that Hioki would never, ever forget. But as she sat there on the couch trying to brainstorm the perfect birthday celebration, she just kept drawing a blank. It felt like the only thing she could really focus on that they shared was their romantic nature. They were both very romantic people. So whatever she did, it had to be romantic in some way. But how? She wasn't sure. In many ways, she and her husband were very different in how they expressed their affection. Hioki was still that quiet, reserved person he'd always been. His displays of affection were usually very reserved and private just for her. But Risa, on the other hand, was a massive extrovert. She was full of energy, and so her displays of affection were often over the top, big, and boisterous. So Risa was really struggling, trying to think of how she could combine their two styles of romance into one perfect celebration. And then, all of a sudden, it was like she had an epiphany. She saw it perfectly in her mind's eye. The perfect way to celebrate his birthday. She didn't even know what had inspired it, it just came to her in a flash. She would take her husband out for a very romantic walk on the beach at night. But then, at the end of the walk, there would be this huge surprise. An over-the-top fireworks display just for him. It was the perfect idea. It was romantic, and it was a little crazy, just like her. 2 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, Risa and 6 of her friends were at Osaki Beach. This was the beach where the big birthday surprise was going to happen that very night. Risa had spent the previous day while Hioki was at work planning out all the details of the party. But now, on the day of, there was some actual physical setup that needed to be done. This wasn't just going to be a walk on the beach with some fireworks. There was another element to her plan, a secret prank element, and she needed her friends' help for that. So, on this afternoon, they were walking along the beach looking for the perfect spot. The spot needed to do 2 things. First, it had to afford Risa and her husband some privacy, so it would feel very romantic and intimate. But it also needed to have a good vantage point for her friends, a place where they could hide and watch the couple. They needed to be able to see Risa's signal so they would know exactly when to light the fireworks. And so Risa and her friends are walking along the sand, scanning the coastline, and then they see it. There was this private, sort of secluded section of the beach that had a long row of thick shrubbery lining the back of it. It was perfect. The bushes would be a perfect hiding spot for her friends. And the beach itself, down on the sand, was nice and private and peaceful. They all agreed this was the best spot for the big party. So, they got to work. Her friends went up into the bushes and started getting their fireworks ready, figuring out the best way to set them up for a quick launch. Meanwhile, Risa went down to the sandy part of the beach and she prepped the area where she and Hioki would be standing. The final touch was laying out a big blue sheet on the sand. This would be their mark, the spot where they needed to be for the surprise to work perfectly. Once the blue sheet was in place, she walked back up to her friends in the bushes. They all confirmed that everything was ready to go. Risa told her friends the plan was to be back there that night at exactly 10 p.m. with her husband. She told them they should probably get there a little bit earlier, just to make sure they were all set up and hidden. They all agreed, and then they packed up and left the beach. As Risa left the beach that afternoon, she found herself feeling incredibly antsy. She was just so excited about this big surprise party she had planned for that night. She just wanted it to be 10 p.m. already so she could finally reveal everything she had in store for Hioki. But she also knew she had to play it cool. She couldn't give away any hint that she had this big surprise planned. So, when she got back home where Hioki was waiting, she acted like everything was totally normal. When she walked inside, she told Hioki to just go relax on the couch while she made them both a very nice dinner. She wanted to pamper him a little bit. When dinner was ready, the two of them sat down at the table. Risa pretended like she had absolutely nothing planned for his birthday weekend. She casually asked him, "Hey, what should we do this weekend to celebrate your birthday?" They talked about maybe going to see some friends or going out to a movie, just brainstorming ideas. But of course, it was all a big act. Risa knew exactly what they were doing that night. Later, when it was getting kind of late and it seemed like Hioki was maybe thinking about heading to bed, Risa made her move. She said, "Wait a minute. It's your birthday weekend. Let's not go to bed just yet. Let's go for a walk on the beach." What a great romantic idea that would be. Hioki was a little surprised by the suggestion, it being so late, but he thought about it for a second and then said, "Actually, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go for it." As soon as he said yes, Risa could barely contain her excitement. She knew she had this amazing, incredible thing planned for him down at the beach, and it was about to happen. This was going to be awesome. And so, she and her husband quickly cleaned up the dinner dishes. And then, just before 10 p.m., they left their apartment, got in their car, and started heading to the beach. About 10 minutes later, they parked at the end of a dead-end road right near the beach. When they got out of the car, they were surrounded by bushes on all sides of the road. But there was a little sandy path that cut through the bushes and led down to the open beach. As Risa led Hioki down this path and onto the sand, she quickly realized she had a very big problem. There was virtually no moonlight. The sky was overcast, and it was basically pitch black out on the beach. This was a huge issue. Remember, she had put out that blue blanket to mark the exact spot where she and Hioki needed to be. It was their position marker, so that her friends, who were hidden nearby in the bushes, would know when and where to light off the fireworks. The entire plan, the entire surprise, was contingent on them getting to that blue blanket. And it was so dark that not only was Risa unable to see the blue blanket from a distance, she could barely even see the sand right in front of her feet. It was so dark, it was almost eerie out there. And you have to remember, this was in 2011. You couldn't just pull out your cell phone and turn on a powerful flashlight. That feature didn't really exist yet. So the best they could do was to pull out their phones, tap on the screen to wake them up, and use the little bit of light coming from the home screen to try and guide their way. After walking on the beach for just a short ways, Hioki actually stopped Risa. He said, "Hey, I don't think it's safe to be walking on the beach right now. We really can't see where we're going at all. Let's go back to the car and see if we have a flashlight." But Risa knew her friends were already in position. They were waiting in those shrubs down the beach, ready to light off those fireworks. And she figured they probably couldn't see very well either. She started to worry that if she and Hioki didn't get to the spot soon, her friends might panic. Maybe they'd think something was wrong, or maybe they'd light off the fireworks prematurely. She didn't know what might happen, but she was starting to get worried that her whole perfect plan was falling apart. She couldn't afford to be late. And so she told her husband, "No, let's not go back for flashlights. Let's just keep walking. It's no big deal. The sand is flat." And so the two of them continued walking along the beach, holding up their dimly lit cell phone screens to try and guide them. But pretty quickly, Hioki started to notice that Risa seemed really anxious, and she was walking way too fast. This was supposed to be a peaceful, romantic walk on the beach, but Risa was walking like a woman on a mission. She was striding ahead of him, clearly trying to get somewhere specific. But he didn't understand where she was trying to go. Finally, he called out to her and said, "Hey, what's going on? Why are you walking so quickly? What are we doing out here?" And so finally, she just stopped. She turned and looked at her husband, and she was about to tell him what was actually going on. She felt like the surprise was ruined at this point anyway, and she basically needed his help if they were ever going to find this blanket and figure out where they needed to be. But right as Risa opened her mouth to tell her husband what was going on, suddenly, it was like the whole world went completely black. There was no more ambient light from their cell phones, no more minimal moonlight, nothing. Just absolute blackness and then a sudden, jarring silence. At that exact same time, Risa's friends were not that far away, hiding up in the bushes just like they had planned. But, much like Risa and Hioki, they had also been dealing with the problem of not being able to see anything. It was so incredibly dark. They had gotten into position, but they couldn't even see the sand clearly from where they were hiding. They had absolutely no idea if Risa and Hioki were in position or not. But they could hear them. They could hear the faint sound of Risa and Hioki talking, somewhere out there on the sand in the darkness. The friends were whispering back and forth to each other in the bushes. How are we going to know when they're actually in position? How are we going to get the signal to light off the fireworks? We can't see them at all, and so the friends were feeling really unsure about what to do. They were straining their eyes, peering out onto the dark sand, trying to see Risa, trying to see Hioki. But again, they couldn't see them. They couldn't even see the blue blanket that they knew wasn't that far away. And so they were just looking and listening, and they could kind of tell that the voices they were hearing were probably Risa and Hioki. And it sounded like they were moving in their general direction. But then, suddenly, they heard screams. The screams were coming from the same direction as the voices they believed were their friends. At first, for just a split second, they thought the screams might actually be the signal. Like a loud, crazy signal to light off the fireworks. But the screams didn't sound happy. They sounded like somebody was in serious trouble. And critically, as soon as the screaming started, it abruptly stopped. It was just a couple of high-pitched, awful screams, and then total silence. Absolute, total silence on the beach. And again, they couldn't see anything. So, they had no idea what was going on. They didn't even know for sure if that was Risa and Hioki, but they had a terrible feeling that something was wrong. So they abandoned the fireworks plan completely. They left their hiding spot in the bushes and they charged out onto the beach. They were looking all around, shouting their friends' names, but they still really couldn't see anything. They couldn't even find the blue blanket, and they knew roughly where it was supposed to be. And so they're running around the beach in the dark. They're calling out for Hioki and Risa, but they're not hearing anything back. For a full 30 minutes, they were just running around in a panic, looking for their friends, just knowing in their gut that something bad had just happened. And then, at some point, one of the friends doubled back. They went roughly to the area where they knew the blue blanket was supposed to be. And that's when they made a discovery. It would turn out that when Risa and Hioki were out on that beach, walking around in the total darkness, Risa actually did find the blue sheet that she had set up. Except it was so dark that even though they were, at one point, literally standing on the blanket, she and Hioki couldn't even tell it was that dark. Now, that might not seem like it would be catastrophic until you consider what was underneath that blanket. So, 2 days earlier, when Risa had her big epiphany about how to create the best birthday ever for Hioki, she had been inspired in part by the show they were watching on TV. That hidden camera comedy show that she and Hioki both loved. The show was called Arashi's Big Secret, and its comedy really came from the over-the-top pranks that the show's hosts would pull on Japanese celebrities. And one of those pranks, a recurring one, was to dig a large hole on the beach, cover it up, and then trick somebody into accidentally falling into it. And so Risa thought, what a great idea. What if I dig a hole on the beach, cover it up, and then after our romantic walk, I'll have Hioki fall into the hole as a funny prank. And then my friends will immediately fire off those fireworks. It'll be like he's on the game show that we love so much. It was supposed to be a perfect combination of a romantic, fun time on the beach, a harmless prank, and then a big birthday celebration afterwards. It was, in her mind, the perfect plan. However, Risa had made a terrible, fatal miscalculation. On the game show, when they would dig these holes in the beach, they would cover them with a very specific material. It was basically dried foam, almost like styrofoam. The instant one of their contestants or celebrities stepped directly on the foam, it would immediately break and they would fall safely, feet first, into the hole. But what Risa did was different. After she and her friends dug this deep hole, getting ready for the big party, she covered it first with a thick, rigid piece of plastic. It was almost like a thin sheet of plywood, but made of hard plastic. So she covered the hole with that, and that was the platform. And then she covered that platform with the blue sheet so that to the naked eye, it just looked like the ground was level underneath. In Risa's mind, this rigid piece of plastic would break the instant her husband stepped on it. She thought it wasn't that strong. Maybe it was strong enough to hold him for a second, but it would definitely snap in the middle and he would fall in, just like on the show. But in reality, when she and her husband inadvertently walked onto that blue sheet without even realizing it because it was so dark, that piece of plastic didn't break. It was too rigid. Instead of breaking, the plastic just suddenly tilted to one side. It acted like a trapdoor. This caused both Risa and her husband to suddenly tumble forward, both of them headfirst into this deep hole. And as they fell, their weight on the edge of the hole caused a massive avalanche of sand to pour in from all sides, completely covering the two of them up. And so Risa and Hioki, they screamed for just a second as they began to fall into the ground. And then suddenly, they were upside down and completely buried all the way to the top by heavy, wet sand. That's why it went silent after the screams. It was because they were completely buried alive. Risa's friends, after searching the beach after hearing those screams, they would eventually find the blue blanket. It was partially submerged in the sand. They really didn't know what had happened, but because of the screams and what they were now seeing, they just immediately called the authorities. When the emergency crews came out to the beach, it would take them nearly 30 minutes to finally dig Risa and Hioki out from that hole. But by that point, it was far too late. They had both suffocated to death. One morning, in the winter of 1856, a 27-year-old explorer named Dr. Edward Fogel sat down for breakfast. He was at the home where he was staying in the city of Abashir, which was in a kingdom called Wadai in Central Africa. Edward poured himself a cup of milk, and then, even though the table in front of him was full of warm breads and cakes and porridge, Edward called a servant over. He asked her to please get him a plate of boiled eggs. But the servant just apologized and explained, "I'm very sorry, but we don't have any eggs this morning. We are all out." Edward was disappointed, but he just thanked the servant anyway, and she left. Edward was visiting Africa from his home country of Germany. He was on a map-making expedition, and he'd been staying in Abashir for the past 2 weeks. So far, all the local food he had tried really upset his stomach. Everything except for eggs. So, for literally every single meal since he had arrived, the only thing he would eat was eggs. And now, because they were out of eggs, despite there being all this other perfectly good food to choose from, he knew he couldn't eat it without getting sick. And so, he would just have to go hungry. But outside of the food issue, overall, Edward thought the city of Abashir was okay. He had been given the chance to meet the king, who had then arranged for him to stay in this very nice home that was owned by a local noble family. And the area itself was extremely beautiful. Edward was on track to be the very first European to successfully make a detailed map of it, which meant that he would essentially be creating history. But Edward just really was not getting along with the local people. They seemed to him to be kind of suspicious of him for no reason, and Edward couldn't believe it. They didn't seem to care at all that he was this famous map maker who had come all the way there from Germany to literally put their, what he considered to be, insignificant city onto the map of the whole world. Why didn't they appreciate that? He just couldn't understand it. And now, adding insult to injury, Edward couldn't even eat any breakfast. And so, feeling pretty annoyed, despite all the effort the family had clearly made to feed him that morning, Edward stood up from the table and he left to go spend the day exploring. He walked out into the front courtyard of the home, where another servant was waiting with Edward's horse. Edward spent most of his days in the city just kind of riding around and drawing maps of the streets and the alleyways. But today, this servant warned Edward that he really ought to stay inside. The servant told him it was not safe for him to go out into the city today. At this point in time, the kingdom that Abashir was a part of was at war with several neighboring nations. And so, as a result, everybody in the city was very worried about spies. This meant they were extremely suspicious of any foreigners, like Edward. Now, for the most part, the locals had sort of put up with his presence so far, but to them it just seemed like he was always watching them, always writing in his notebook, but never talking to anyone. And so they had started to gossip about him. But Edward, after being given this warning by the servant, did not take it seriously at all. Instead, he kind of scoffed and said, it's no big deal. I'm not going to be out there for very long anyways. Nothing's going to happen. He then told the servant that he had another plan for the day. His big plan was to leave the city of Abashir and go to this nearby mountain. He wanted to climb up the mountain and get a bird's-eye view of the entire city from the top to help him finish his map. But when Edward said that, the servant looked truly horrified. He told Edward that he simply could not do that because the mountain Edward was clearly talking about was sacred. Nobody was allowed to climb it. It was a very important rule to the people who lived there. But to Edward, this warning didn't land at all. Instead, he just saw it as more evidence that the locals just didn't appreciate what he was doing for them. He was on a very important mission, a mission that was, in his mind, far more important than anything that was sacred to them. And so Edward, he thanked the servant for the warning, but also basically said, look, I'm going to do what I'm going to do because this is really important. And so he said, I'm going to go hike that mountain and I'll see you tonight when I drop off the horse. And then Edward climbed onto the horse and he rode off. But Edward didn't come back. He didn't come back that night, or the day after, or the day after that. And pretty soon, it became very clear that Edward Fogel was missing. Word of Edward's disappearance ultimately made it back to Germany pretty quickly, specifically to the Geography Society that had sent him to Africa on this map-making mission in the first place. So the Geography Society and the German public were very concerned, and they sent several search parties to Africa to go look for Edward. But despite multiple serious attempts over several years, nobody ever found him or figured out what happened to him. And because of this, Edward sort of became famous back in Germany. People began to see him as this brave explorer who thirsted for knowledge and went daringly into the unknown. They imagined all sorts of dramatic and tragic things that might have happened to him. Maybe he had been assassinated by a rival kingdom or taken prisoner. Or maybe he discovered something holy or ancient that he wasn't supposed to see. And so, in time, the story of Edward Fogel got bigger and bigger. He became like a symbol of German pride. This was our great explorer. He had done something amazing, clearly. Also adding intrigue to this already very bizarre mystery was the fact that all of the people who actually went to Africa to look for Edward, all the members of those search parties over the years, literally every single one of them died. Now, we know how those searchers died. It was due to local violence or disease or just plain bad luck. But it sort of added to the intrigue of this mystery. The idea that everybody who went looking for Edward didn't come back, that became part of the lore. And so this mystery just continued to grow and grow. It was passed around and things were embellished and things were fictionalized until finally, almost 20 years after Edward disappeared, another explorer named Gustav Nachtigall decided that he was going to be the one who finally figured out, once and for all, what actually happened to this guy. And so, in the early winter of 1874, Gustav is now in the courtyard outside of his apartment in Abashir. He had actually traveled to Africa to begin his search for the answer. What happened to Edward? And he's standing in this courtyard along with his translator, whose name was Ahmed. The two of them were sitting across from an elderly man who was friends with the current king of Abashir. This elderly man had, at one point, lived in one of the apartments across this very courtyard. And so Gustav asked this old man if he had ever met with a European man about 17 years earlier. And Ahmed translated the question for him. And the old man said, yes, he had. He remembered that one European man had come to meet with the king around that time. He said the man had always been writing in this notebook, but he had never seemed to want to speak to anybody and had, for the most part, just kept to himself. But the old man said that, beyond his general impression of the guy, he really didn't know anything about him. He had no idea what he was doing there or what ultimately happened to him. So at this point, both Gustav and Ahmed had been in Abashir for 2 months. And in that time, they had been trying to ask around and see if anybody remembered Edward. And so far, they had run into a few people who did seem to remember him, like this older man, because it was pretty rare to see a European person in the city. But unfortunately, nobody had any specific information on how or when Edward had disappeared. Or, in the rare case that they did seem to know more, they refused to talk about it. And so for Gustav, on the one hand, this was incredibly frustrating. All he wanted was the truth. But on the other hand, as he ran into more and more people who seemed apprehensive to even talk about Edward at all, that sort of suggested that maybe something really bad did happen to Edward when he was in Abashir. And if that was the case, if some horrible fate befell him, Gustav knew there was one person in this city who almost certainly would know the truth. But Gustav basically couldn't ask this one person any questions about Edward without being incredibly offensive. Because this one person was the current king of Abashir, King Ali. And it would have been his father who had met Edward and arranged for him to stay with that noble family when he was doing his map-making. And so, for Edward to have been killed or captured, or if something horrible had happened to him while he was in Abashir, well, King Ali's father would have had to have given the okay. Or he would have at least known about it and been okay with it. He would have known something, making him complicit in whatever happened to Edward. And so to ask King Ali, hey, what do you think happened to Edward? You could be potentially suggesting that his own father did something terrible. But it was more than that. What Ahmed had told Gustav was that you don't just risk offending the king by asking those questions. You might actually be executed for offending the king. And so, what Gustav decided he needed to do, because he was so dead set on trying to solve this mystery, is he still needed to find a way to talk to King Ali about Edward, but without losing his life. He had to come up with a very clever way to get this information out of the king. A few weeks later, Gustav and Ahmed had still not yet come up with a clever way to speak to the king. They couldn't figure out a way to approach the subject without horribly offending him. And so the two of them were in Gustav's apartment eating lunch when suddenly there was a knock at the door. Gustav got up, he went to the door, and when he opened it up, it was a courier. The man told Gustav that he was part of a caravan that had just arrived there from North Africa, and he had some mail for Gustav from back home. He had letters from Germany. He just handed the whole bundle of mail to Gustav. And Gustav, who did not get mail very often, was very excited. He said, "Oh, thank you." He took the mail, thanked the guy again, shut the door, and went back into the common room. And he just began going through the mail, looking to see who had sent him something. And as he was doing it, he suddenly had this great idea. It had nothing to do with what was actually written in the letters. It was just the concept of receiving mail that suddenly gave him this brilliant way to talk to the king. The very next day, Gustav and Ahmed walked into the royal palace in Abashir. When they walked in, they eventually made their way into this bright and airy courtroom. And in this courtroom, on the other end, against the far wall, was King Ali sitting on his throne. So Gustav and Ahmed immediately went over to the king, and they greeted him and they exchanged some pleasantries. And as they were doing that, Gustav, he knew that that same caravan that had come through the day before with his mail had also made a stop at the palace. He knew they had presented the king with all these lavish gifts like a silver tea set and gold watches and all this luxurious fabric. And so Gustav was really hoping that those gifts had put the king in a really good mood, because that was a big part of his plan. At some point, after the pleasantries had stopped, Gustav actually referenced the caravan. He told the king that, in fact, They had also swung by his place and dropped off this big bundle of letters from back home. And he said he was really happy about it. And the king kind of seconded that and said, "Oh yeah, they gave me all these great gifts." Yes, it was so wonderful. And so they're kind of talking back and forth about how great this mail delivery was when Gustav tells this incredible lie to the king. He tells the king, he goes, all those letters, it was really great to hear from home, from my friends, from my family. But there was this one really weird letter in there that I didn't even know who it was from. Now, this letter didn't exist. This was a total fabrication. But he told the king that this weird letter, it was from an elderly man who had written to Gustav to tell him that his son had gone to Abashir many years ago and had never come home again. And so now this elderly man, he knew his son was probably not alive at this point. But in this fictional letter to Gustav, he told Gustav that his son had done a lot of writing in notebooks. And he was hopeful that maybe someone in Abashir still had these notebooks. And could Gustav please get the notebooks and return them to the old man, just to give him some comfort about what his son had been doing and saying and thinking before he disappeared. As soon as Gustav said this, he could actually feel the mood in the throne room shift. He could tell that King Ali was very much on edge about what Gustav might say next. But Gustav had planned for this. And he told the king that, just so you know, all throughout Europe, people think of you as a wise and just king. And so, if by chance you have these notebooks and you were to give them to me so I can give them to this elderly man in his old age so he can have some comfort before he dies, if you would do that, the people of Europe would love you even more for that simple act of kindness. Then Gustav went quiet, and there was this really intense silence in the throne room. But then the king just kind of sat back in his throne and he smiled at Gustav. And as soon as Gustav saw that smile on the king's face, he decided he just had to do it. And he said to the king, "The son's name is Dr. Edward Fogel." And then after that, Gustav just went silent. Because he knew at this point, if the king thought he was lying or trying to trick him, he could easily be executed right here, right now. But King Ali just kept on smiling at Gustav and just said, "You know what? I will think about it." Gustav quickly thanked the king and hurried out of the throne room. And then he went back to his apartment and spent the entire night just pacing around his room, wondering what was going to happen. Part of Gustav was optimistic that maybe the king would come through here and hand over these notebooks if he really did have them. But the other part of Gustav, the more realistic side, thought that maybe what he had just done was effectively sign his own death warrant, and that soon he'd become one of the many travelers who came to Abashir and never went home. A few days later, a very nervous Gustav followed a palace guard back into the throne room. And when he got in there, he immediately saw King Ali sitting on his throne. And Gustav really couldn't read his expression. So he didn't know if the king was mad at him, if he was going to be conciliatory, if he was going to help him. He had no idea. And so Gustav just walked into the room and kind of held his breath. King Ali broke the silence. And when he did, it was clear he was not angry. He was just kind of even-keeled. And he told Gustav that after their conversation, he had gone and spoken to the noble family that Edward had stayed with when he was here. But they told him they couldn't find any of Dr. Edward's writings. They said the notebooks had either been thrown away or lost. And so, unfortunately, there was nothing to send back to Edward's elderly father. Now, Gustav did not believe this for a second. At this time, paper was very scarce. There was no way they would have been just throwing it away or destroying it. Paper was pretty valuable. But he couldn't say that to the king. So he just swallowed his disappointment and thanked the king for asking about the notebooks. And then Gustav hoped that at this point he'd be allowed to leave. But one of the guards put their hand on Gustav's shoulder and said he needed to follow him. And at this point, Gustav's stomach dropped. He assumed he was about to be taken away, to be punished for asking about Edward in the first place. And so Gustav's hands were shaking and his heart was racing as he followed the guard out of the palace and out into the courtyard. There were some horses tied up and waiting for them. Gustav felt nauseous as he followed the guard through the city streets, and he wondered if he should just try to make a break for it and try to escape. But he looked down different streets and alleys and realized that would be totally useless. The palace guards would find him in minutes. So there was nowhere for him to go. And so Gustav had no choice but to just keep on following this guard. Through the city they went. And then eventually they got to the city gates. And Gustav was horrified as they left the city and just began riding out into the wilderness over towards this huge mountain in the distance. And as they were making their way towards this mountain, all Gustav was thinking is that at any moment here, they're going to just dump me here to die, or they're going to ambush me, or something bad is going to happen. At some point, the guard led Gustav all the way to the foot of that mountain. And there, the guard abruptly stopped and climbed off his horse. He just turned around and faced Gustav. And he says, "I am going to tell you exactly what happened to Edward." And Gustav was kind of shocked by this. He really didn't know what was going to happen here. He didn't even know if he was still in danger at this point. But now he was just holding his breath, waiting for this mystery to potentially finally be solved. And so the guard, he looked at Gustav and he said, "Edward committed an unforgivable crime." And he was punished for that crime. Now, at this point, Gustav was shocked. Edward was this very well-traveled and highly respected guy. And it just didn't make sense that he would commit any crime, let alone an unforgivable one that apparently cost him his life. And so Gustav kind of blurted out, "What crime? What did he do?" The guard explained that from day one, Edward had made lots of enemies in Abbashir. He basically spent his days riding all around the city and staring at everybody and writing in his notebooks, but never talking to anybody. And so people began to gossip that maybe he was a spy. And then also, the guard said Edward had climbed their sacred mountain despite being told not to, the mountain that was literally right behind them. And then also, the guard said Edward was just totally unpleasant and just kind of a snobby person that nobody liked. But the guard said, none of that is actually what caused Edward to be punished. Edward's unforgivable crime, the one that caused his downfall, was his insatiable hunger for eggs. At every single meal, he refused all the food his noble host prepared for him and demanded eggs. In Abbashir, eggs were quite rare and were considered a precious gift. And Edward demanded them at every single meal, and he ate all of that noble family's eggs. And so eventually, the nobles, they could not stand Edward's disrespect. And so they went to the king. And the king, who agreed this was just awful what Edward had done, decided the only appropriate punishment was to take Edward and drag him out to the base of that sacred mountain and literally beat him to death. Dr. Edward Vogel, the proud symbol of Germany's exploring spirit, was executed because he ate an offensive number of eggs. Gustav was unharmed. He, unlike Edward, had actually bothered to learn the local customs and was highly respectful. And so he was allowed to leave the city even after being told what happened to Edward. And he would become the first European ever to leave Abbashir alive. As for Edward's notebooks and maps, they were never found. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Sometimes we think we have a solid grip on how the world works. We wake up, we go about our normal routines, and we assume that the rules of reality will keep everything in its proper place. We trust our senses, we trust our minds, and we trust that the environments we step into will behave in predictable ways. But every now and then, the universe decides to throw those rules completely out the window. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that demonstrate just how bizarre, unpredictable, and downright terrifying life can be when the ordinary suddenly collides with the impossible. These are stories about real people who found themselves in situations that sound like they were pulled straight from a Hollywood movie. But every single one of these events actually happened, and the details will leave you questioning how much we truly know about the world around us. From a chaotic clash of identities on the streets of Detroit, to a mysterious voice that acted as a guardian angel in London, and finally to a man who defied the laws of probability in the dark waters of the Atlantic, these stories show us that reality is often much stranger than fiction. Our first story takes us to the city of Detroit, Michigan, specifically to the east side of the city on Andover Street. If you were to ask anyone who lives in this neighborhood, they would tell you right away that Andover Street has a reputation. It is an area that has been heavily affected by drug activity for a very long time. Because of this, the local police department is constantly running operations to try and clean up the streets and keep the community safe. On a cold Thursday morning, specifically November 9th, 2017, two special operations officers from the Detroit Police Department were getting ready to start a specific type of undercover operation known as a push-off. Now, if you are not familiar with what a push-off is, it is basically a reverse sting operation. Undercover police officers will set themselves up in an area, usually in a house that is known for drug transactions, and they will pretend to be the local drug dealers. When unsuspecting customers walk up to the house trying to buy drugs, the undercover officers will invite them inside, wait for them to make a verbal request to purchase illegal substances, and then immediately arrest them and seize their vehicles. These two particular special operations officers had been working deep undercover in this specific neighborhood for quite a while. Because they had been there so long, they had a very specific local drug house that they had secured and set up for this exact operation. They arrived at the house, got themselves in character, and began to wait. Meanwhile, not too far away, another unit from a completely different police precinct was planning their own drug enforcement operation for that very same day. This second unit consisted of a group of undercover officers who were running a buy-bust operation. A buy-bust is the exact opposite of a push-off. In a buy-bust, undercover officers pretend to be drug buyers. They walk around the neighborhood, look for active drug houses, and attempt to buy illegal substances from real drug dealers. Once the transaction is initiated, they signal their backup team to swoop in and make the arrest. But the problem was that there was a massive breakdown in communication between the two different police precincts. Neither group had any idea that the other group was operating on Andover Street that morning. It was a classic bureaucratic oversight, but on the streets, it was a recipe for disaster. Around midday, two undercover officers from the 2nd Precinct were walking down Andover Street looking for active drug houses. They saw the house where the first two undercover officers were waiting. To the officers from the 2nd Precinct, this house looked exactly like a real active drug house, and to the officers inside, the two men walking up to the porch looked exactly like typical drug customers. The two undercover buyers walked up the steps and knocked on the front door. The undercover officers inside opened the door, looked them over, and in accordance with their training, invited them inside. The buyers walked in and sat down in the living room. The undercover officers, acting as dealers, asked them what they were looking for. The buyers then asked if they could purchase some drugs. As soon as those words left their mouths, the undercover officers, acting as dealers, whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and ordered the two men to get on the ground. But instead of complying, the two buyers did something that absolutely shocked the dealers. They also whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and yelled back that no, they were the ones who needed to get on the ground. At this point, both groups of officers were standing in a freezing, high-tension standoff. Neither side believed the other side was actually telling the truth. In the high-stakes world of undercover operations, criminals will often pose as police officers to rob rival dealers or escape arrest. So, the officers from the 1st Precinct were convinced that these two buyers were actually armed criminals using fake police badges. And the officers from the 2nd Precinct were convinced that the dealers were criminals trying to rip them off with fake badges of their own. They stood there, guns pointed at each other, in a tense standoff that looked exactly like that famous scene from The Office, where everyone is pointing a gun at everyone else, trying to figure out who the double agent is. They began periodically hurling insults and threats at each other, trying to force the other side to stand down. But nobody was backing down. The tension in the room was boiling over, and both sides were terrified that if they fired a shot, it would end in a bloodbath. But instead of pulling their triggers, when neither side stood down, they all eventually lowered their weapons. But they did not talk it out. Instead, they lunged at each other and proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other. A massive, chaotic fistfight broke out right there in the living room. Within moments, the backup officers from both precincts, who had been waiting nearby in unmarked vehicles, saw the commotion and rushed into the house. But instead of breaking up the fight, they also got confused and joined in. It turned into a massive brawl of police officers fighting other police officers, with punches flying, furniture breaking, and complete chaos taking over the house. After the dust finally settled and the haymakers had stopped, someone finally managed to get a radio transmission through, and the two groups of police suddenly realized the monumental mistake they had just made. They immediately stopped fighting and began to apologize to one another, nursing their bruises and panting for air. Luckily, none of the officers were critically injured in this bizarre mix-up. However, two officers did have to be taken to the hospital for treatment, though fortunately their injuries were very minor. One officer ended up with a massive black eye, and another had a split lip. When the news of this incident got out, Detroit's own chief of police, along with the media and the public at large, all came out and said that this entire snafu was a total embarrassment for the department. It showed a clear lack of coordination and communication. But, on the other hand, some people argued that the officers involved actually deserved a little bit of credit. After all, their job was to be undercover. And they were apparently so incredibly good at being undercover that they were able to completely fool other trained professional police officers who were looking for the exact same things. It turns out they were just too good at their jobs, but you can be the judge of that. Our next story was pulled from a 1997 article published in the prestigious British medical journal, The Show. This article was written by a psychiatrist who personally treated the patient, who will be the focal point of this story. The only reason we bring this up right at the beginning is because this story sounds so completely made up that if it were not documented in an official, peer-reviewed medical journal, it would be almost impossible to believe. One night in the cold winter of 1984, a healthy, middle-aged woman, who we will call Brenda for the sake of this story, was sitting in her quiet home in London, England. It was a completely normal, peaceful evening. Brenda was sitting on her couch, enjoying the quiet warmth of her living room and reading a book. But as she was reading, she suddenly heard a voice speak directly in her head. The voice did not sound like her own thoughts, and it did not sound like it was coming from the room around her. It was a distinct, clear, calm voice that spoke directly into her mind. The voice said, "Please do not be afraid." I know this must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this was the easiest way I could think of. My friend and I, we used to work at the Children's Hospital, and we would like to help you. Brenda sat frozen on her couch. She could not believe what was happening. She had absolutely no history of mental illness, she had never heard voices in her head before, and she was a completely rational, healthy person. The voice she was hearing was so incredibly clear, and it did not sound like any voice she had ever heard in her real life. At first, Brenda did not do anything. She just sat there on the couch holding her book, waiting and hoping that this was just some strange, fleeting trick of her mind. But the voice in her head seemed to pick up on her internal panic. The voice spoke again and said, "Brenda, this is not a hallucination. We are real, and we want to help you." Brenda did not believe the voice was real. She was absolutely convinced that she had just lost her mind and was experiencing some kind of sudden, severe mental breakdown. For the rest of the night, she did her absolute best to completely ignore the voice in her head, trying to focus on anything else. First thing the next morning, Brenda went to her doctor's office, explained what was happening, and begged them for help. The doctor was very concerned and immediately referred her to a local psychiatrist. Brenda went over to the psychiatrist's office, and they performed a thorough psychological evaluation. After talking with her, the psychiatrist admitted that they did not really know why she was suddenly hearing these voices. There was absolutely no clear medical explanation or typical trigger for why a healthy, middle-aged woman with no history of mental issues would suddenly start hearing clear, distinct voices. So Brenda was ultimately diagnosed with a rare condition called functional hallucinatory psychosis. This diagnosis basically meant that Brenda was indeed hallucinating, but there was no clear physical or psychological reason why it was happening. The psychiatrist began treating Brenda with a strong antipsychotic drug, and they also set up regular supportive counseling sessions. Over the next couple of weeks, Brenda was incredibly diligent. She took her medications exactly as prescribed, and she never missed a single appointment. And slowly but surely, the voices in her mind began to fade, and eventually they stopped completely. Brenda was overjoyed. She went back into her psychiatrist's office, looked at him, and said, "Doctor, you have saved me. The voices are completely gone, and I am so happy." The psychiatrist would later write in his medical journal that Brenda was visibly relieved during this appointment. It was completely obvious to him that she was not making any of this up. She had really believed she was hearing these voices, she had been terrified by them, and now she was profoundly grateful to have her life back to normal. After leaving the office, Brenda decided that she and her family needed to celebrate. They decided to go on a vacation outside of London just to relax and enjoy the fact that she had not, in fact, lost her mind. But while they were away on holiday, enjoying the peaceful countryside, the nightmare returned. Brenda suddenly heard the voices in her head again. But this time, the tone was different. It was urgent. The voices told her that she had to get back to London as soon as possible because there was something terribly wrong with her. Along with this warning, the voices did something even more bizarre. They gave her a very specific street address in London that she was supposed to go to in order to seek immediate treatment. Brenda was absolutely horrified. She was devastated that the voices were back after she thought she was cured, but she was also incredibly scared by the specific nature of what they were saying. She began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was some terrifying truth to what these voices were telling her. What if there really was something horribly wrong with her body? Brenda ran to her husband crying and explained everything that had just happened. Her husband was a very loving and reassuring man. He held her and told her that she should just try to totally ignore the voices again. He pointed out that they had gone away before with medication, and there was probably nothing physically wrong with her. He urged her to just try to relax and enjoy the rest of their vacation. But Brenda could not relax. No matter what her husband said, she could not ignore the voices because they were constantly speaking to her now, repeating the same urgent message over and over again. They kept saying, "You need to leave, you need to go back, there is something wrong with you." Finally, unable to bear the constant mental pressure, Brenda convinced her family to end their vacation early, pack up their things, and head back to London. As soon as they arrived in the city, Brenda made her husband get in the car with her, and they drove straight to the exact street address the voices had given her. When they arrived and stepped out of the car, they found themselves standing right in front of the brain scan unit of a London hospital. Brenda and her husband stood on the pavement, completely shocked. They had never been to this building before, and Brenda had no prior knowledge of this specific medical facility or its address. But before they could even begin to process the sheer impossibility of what they were looking at, the voices in Brenda's head came back with absolute clarity. They told her that she needed to go inside the building immediately and request a brain scan for two very specific reasons. First, they said there was a tumor in her brain. Second, they said this tumor was causing her brain stem to swell. At first, Brenda went inside the brain scan facility and requested an immediate scan, honestly admitting to the reception staff that voices in her head had directed her to this exact address. Because she had no official doctor referral, the hospital had to turn her away, leaving Brenda in a state of absolute panic. She immediately called her psychiatrist, explaining how the voices had guided her to this real medical building. The psychiatrist was highly skeptical, but agreed to order the scan anyway, solely to put her mind at ease. A month later, Brenda had the scan done, and the results completely shocked the entire medical community. The scan revealed she indeed had a brain tumor, and her brain stem was swollen, despite her showing absolutely no physical symptoms. After consulting her family, Brenda chose immediate surgery. As soon as she made the decision, the voices told her she had made the right choice. The surgery was a total success. In the recovery room, the voices spoke to her one last time, saying they were pleased to have helped her and said goodbye. Brenda never heard them again. To this day, the medical community still has no explanation for who or what those voices in Brenda's head really were. Our final story is about a man named Michael Packard, who might be either the luckiest or unluckiest person alive, depending on how you look at his incredible life. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he survived a horrific plane crash over the jungles of Costa Rica that tragically killed the pilot, co-pilot, and another passenger on impact. Michael and 4 other survivors were left badly injured and stranded in the extremely remote wilderness for 48 agonizing hours before search and rescue teams finally reached them. Doctors later told him he would not have survived another night in the jungle. Over the next 2 decades, Michael, a commercial diver by trade, survived 2 separate great white shark encounters off California, got lost at sea for hours in the open ocean before being miraculously rescued, and even discovered a long-time missing person's body 60 feet underwater off the coast of Massachusetts. But absolutely none of these events compare to what happened to him on the morning of June 11th, 2021, when he experienced a 1 in a trillion event that baffled scientists around the world. On that peaceful summer morning, the 57-year-old Michael climbed into his boat with his longtime diving partner Josiah, heading out off the coast of Cape Cod to do some lobster diving. Around 8 in the morning, after successfully gathering about 100 pounds of lobsters, Michael decided to go down for one final dive. Josiah watched from the boat as Michael disappeared below the surface of the calm water. Suddenly, Josiah saw a massive, violent eruption of white water where Michael had just submerged, followed by a dark shadow moving rapidly below. Michael had been descending to 60 feet when, at about 45 feet, something hit him from behind like a freight train, immediately plunging him into total darkness and knocking his mouthpiece out. Fumbling around in panic, Michael felt soft, warm, quivering, muscular walls that were actively pulsating. He managed to find his regulator, took a deep breath, and realized there were no sharp teeth, meaning he was not inside a shark. He had actually been scooped up by a giant humpback whale. Humpback whales only eat very small fish, and when this whale realized it had accidentally swallowed a human and a heavy metal scuba tank, it began violently shaking its head side to side to eject him. This thrashing was what caused the dramatic eruption of water Josiah saw from the boat. After 45 agonizing seconds inside the whale's mouth, Michael was finally spat back out into the open water. He swam directly to the surface, saw the whale's tail fins swimming away, and was pulled to safety by Josiah. Miraculously, Michael suffered only minor bruising on his legs and was released from the hospital that very same afternoon. He remained incredibly casual about the encounter, telling reporters he could not wait to heal up and get back to lobster diving. These 3 stories, as different as they are, remind us of a powerful truth. We live our lives under the illusion of control, believing our minds, our identities, and our natural world are completely predictable. But whether it is undercover police officers clashing on a Detroit street, a mysterious voice pointing to a silent brain tumor in London, or a commercial diver being swallowed by a gentle giant of the deep off Cape Cod, we are always just one moment away from the completely unbelievable. These events show us that the division between reality and fiction is incredibly thin, and sometimes the strangest mysteries are the ones that actually happen. They leave us with a lingering sense of wonder and a reminder that no matter how much we plan, the universe will always find a way to surprise us. So perhaps the real question is not whether these stories are true or not, but how many similar stories exist that we will never hear about. Because the truth is, moments like these come without warning. They don't follow the rules. And when they happen, they change everything. If you've made it this far, you already know reality is unfair. See you in the next story.